Dorothy Thompson, 60, entered her St. Bernard, Louisiana bank in the early afternoon on the 13th of April, 1985. She walked slowly since her hip hurt sharply with every step. She tried not to limp or appear shaky. She knew her small-town residents. She knew how they liked to speak and gossip about her, so she didn't give them new fodder. Even though she tried to walk tall and steady, the few tellers and customers in the lobby turned to look at her as soon as she entered. The quiet muttering began after they took her in. The quiet village of St. Bernard was 5 miles from New Orleans. People seemed pleasant there. Everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. Although charming, little towns had a sinister side. It facilitated rapid rumor spread. Dorothy seems to be the subject of most rumors for years. Dorothy conceded that she had given them much to talk about over the years. For most of her 39 years in this town, she owned the pet cemetery. Not just a few backyard tombs. Real, reputable business. Dorothy earned money from pet owners who bought plots in her cemetery to bury their pets. Dorothy was gossiped about for other reasons. The sting was that she owned more than the pet cemetery. She resided there. She lived alone in a cemetery front house. Most people thought it was impossible, especially with the cemetery's spooky stories. How could anyone live there full-time with all that? The ghost stories told in whispers weren't just about the creatures buried there. They concerned people. Dorothy's husbands and others perished on this land. Her first husband was a severe drinker and abuser. Her situation became so dire that she shot him in self-defense. Right there, he died. Her second spouse committed suicide. Dorothy discovered his body on their porch. 2 successive deaths sparked more Dorothy stories. Suggests she was a black widow who killed her husband. The gossips and storytellers didn't realize how deeply that death affected her. However, her mother's death 6 years earlier nearly broke her. Dorothy was deeply depressed after her mother died, and she spent a lengthy time in the hospital. She was improving, but some days were still hard. Dorothy tried to ignore the looks and whispers as she walked to the teller's window in the bank. She had to withdraw money to pay her handyman, Kenny Palmier. He helped her to the graveyard that morning. Since Dorothy didn't drive, Kenny was her chauffeur for the day. He was outside waiting to run her some more errands. Dorothy informed the teller of her budget. The teller counted and handed Dorothy the money, and she turned around and left in the afternoon heat. Dorothy was in Kenny's passenger seat as he drove along the highway at 4 in the afternoon. He took her home when they finished at the grocery shop. They spoke about the weather and Kenny's cemetery work that morning as they drove. Actually, Dorothy didn't know Kenny. The day prior, she employed him. He seemed polite, so she hoped he would stay. Over the past year, her handyman had a high turnover rate, and she needed consistency. Dorothy was no longer able to maintain the pet cemetery and her residence on the grounds. In addition to her damaged hip, she took depression medicine related that her weak and disoriented. Dorothy occasionally asked her neighbors for help, but she preferred hiring. She thought people needed solid work, she could help, and she appreciated it. However, several of her recent handymen were crooks, making employing them problematic. Last fall, her handyman, Elkin Childress, resided with her and worked on the grounds. However, Elkin always wandered the property instead of caring for it. Then she learned he was arrested for robbery. She thought he was scoping the property for ways to break in or steal. She was lucky he quit before she fired him. The person preceding Elkin was worse. He was Brandon, naughtier. Brandon, a loudmouth, started working for Dorothy after her mother died. Brandon and Bonnie moved in with Dorothy so Brandon could fix things while Bonnie drove her about. Like Elkin, she struggled with stealing with the naughtiers. Dorothy was on a lot of medicine for a severe depressed episode the previous spring. While she was sleepy from medication, the naughtiers got her to give them her land for pennies. When Dorothy finally discovered what had transpired, she demanded the naughtiers leave and hired a lawyer to overturn the transaction. Dorothy had spent the last year in a terrible, stressful court battle with the naughtiers over her land. She knew they were mad at her. Additionally, Brandon, a loudmouth, kept bragging about the dispute across town. He was not only talking about it publicly, but also contacting Dorothy directly to encourage her to withdraw the lawsuit. Dorothy would not abandon it. Her mother owned this cemetery and land, which she now owned. She cared greatly. She wouldn't surrender. Dorothy watched Kenny get off the freeway and onto her lengthy driveway from the passenger seat. Her driveway wound through thick trees because her house was far from town. She saw some tombstones ahead as they got closer to her home. The cemetery was huge. Just almost every animal was buried there. Some cemeteries were basic etched stone slabs, but others were lavish, like a human-sized Buddha statue for a pet cat. Kenny stopped in front of the home and helped Dorothy carry her shopping. Dorothy paid him and promised to call when she had more work. Kenny went back in his car and drove down the long driveway till he disappeared into the trees. She stared from her door. Dorothy drank a glass of wine and turned on the TV in her bedroom at 9. After reviewing bills and answering cemetery clients' calls all evening, she was fatigued. After getting comfortable in bed, she heard the phone ring from across the house. Dorothy moaned. To answer the call, she took her wine glass and shuffled down the hallway to the kitchen. When she took it up, Patricia Newman, her friend, spoke. 3 years previously, a mutual friend introduced Patricia, half Dorothy's age, to her. Since Patricia had worked with the elderly, she initially cared for Dorothy. However, they got along well and were close, almost like mother-daughter. Dorothy relied on Patricia virtually daily for medication supervision and appointment transportation, as she lived 10 minutes away. Besides the hired workers, Patricia was the one she spent most time with. Patricia called now because of that. She inquired about Dorothy's pharmacy ride the next day. Dorothy said she did and thanked her. They talked longer before saying goodnight. Dorothy ended the call. After pouring herself more wine, she stood in her kitchen listening to the crickets. She heard something right before she left the kitchen and went to bed. The sound was a car gently climbing her lengthy driveway. Patricia Newman parked outside Dorothy's house after 1 in the afternoon the next morning. Patricia contacted Dorothy at 9 that morning to say she'd be late getting her up, but Dorothy didn't answer. Patricia called several more times after that, but Dorothy never answered, making her apprehensive. Dorothy was in her 60s, drank heavily, and took many medications. Patricia suspected Dorothy wasn't answering because of an accident or medical issue. She was to Dorothy's residence to check on her and do her errands. Patricia dashed to Dorothy's front door from her automobile. But no one answered when she knocked. After a while, she looked in the windows but saw no Dorothy or activity. The house felt quiet and silent. Back at the front door, Patricia tried the knob, but it was locked. Her knocking continued for a time. Patricia left the front door, got back in her car, and called the police after a few more minutes of Dorothy not answering and seeing no one. Patricia returned to Dorothy's house soon after, watching anxiously as 2 police officers opened her back door. In the few minutes before the authorities arrived, Patricia indicated how Dorothy could be inside and presumably harmed or that something was badly wrong. Officers spread out to search the house for entryways. They found the back door jammed, not locked. They were unjamming it now. After a few quick kicks, the door opened, and the 2 officers and Patricia entered. Patricia shouted Dorothy's name and searched every room. She suddenly realized she was hearing Dorothy's bedroom's TV. She glanced in the bedroom but didn't find Dorothy. Dorothy was nowhere to be found following a thorough house check. No issues were present in the house either. No disruption, struggle, or fall was present. Just like Dorothy vanished, it was over. The 2 officers were confused by the circumstance. Their perception was that nothing bad had transpired. This was not an emergency. Just left their TV on and wasn't home when they should have been. That was worrisome, but not enough to prompt a government response. Patricia knew Dorothy. She saw that this was so unlike her pal that something was awry. Patricia strongly expressed her anxiety to the 2 officers, but they encouraged her to wait, give it a few days, and call Dorothy again. If she didn't show up in 2 days, she could chat to them again. Patricia did as instructed when the police left, despite feeling something was wrong. She went home. She kept calling Dorothy, but got no answer. She asked about town, whether anyone had seen or heard from her, but nobody did. After 4 days, Patricia called the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office again. This time, she urged them to do something because Dorothy Thompson was still missing, and Patricia was confident she had been hurt. Detective Brian Valalong drove his cruiser into Dorothy Thompson's pet graveyard at 10:35 a.m. on the day Patricia made her urgent cry for help 4 days after Dorothy disappeared, with Sergeant Terrence Strada. The St. Bernard Sheriff's Office assigned both men to investigate Dorothy's disappearance. Valalong felt uneasy as he drove past dozens of animal tombstones and grave sites before arriving at the area. This place always frightened him. Finally, the cop's cruiser reached Dorothy's home at the end of the driveway. Valalong saw Patricia, a woman in her 30s, standing near the front door immediately. She appeared anxious and impatient as she waited for Valalong and Strada to exit their automobile. She was direct when they exited and approached her. She said the last officers only checked for welfare, not a search. To ensure Dorothy wasn't on the property, she needed them to examine Dorothy's house and grounds. Valalong and Strada promised to do so. She had to start over and describe the last time she saw or spoke to Dorothy. Patricia sounded annoyed and said she'd informed the other cops everything she knew, both in person and over the phone. She just wanted the quest to continue. But Valalong persisted. He said, "Look, I don't fully know the whole story, so please give me the information." She reluctantly informed Valalong. The night of the 13th, she called her friend to offer Dorothy a ride to the pharmacy the next day. Dorothy agreed. Patricia called her friend the next day to confirm she would pick her up that morning, but Dorothy didn't answer. Patricia visited the residence. Dorothy was absent. Dorothy didn't answer when she knocked. Patricia phoned the police because something seemed wrong. Arriving, they discovered the back door unlocked but jammed. After forcing it open, they walked inside and found nothing, but Dorothy was gone. No rhyme or rationale existed. Patricia now believed Dorothy had suffered and hoped they could help her. Valalong nodded and asked Patricia whether Dorothy had friends or family she could have stayed with. Patricia quickly declined. Dorothy lived alone and rarely left her house. She didn't drive, thus she had no car. Patricia stated she had called around but was not seen. No relatives, friends, or anyone. Patricia then became evident. She told officers she thought Dorothy would only leave her house that day or night if forced. Valalong inspected Strada. He knew Patricia was anxious about her buddy, but they needed to check first. He requested Patricia to show them the unlocked door so they could investigate. Valalong, Strada, and Patricia entered the home from the back entry moments later. He looked around the home and saw that Patricia was right. It was clean. There was no evidence of trouble within the residence. No trace of struggle or fall. It looked like the house was unaltered. That countered Patricia's notion that Dorothy would only leave if forced, implying a struggle. Dorothy seemed frail, according to Patricia. Valalong thought maybe she was forced out, but she didn't fight, so there's no trouble. Who knew? But it seemed unusual that nothing had been relocated if they were talking about an abduction. Valalong also saw valuable objects like Dorothy's TV as he walked around the house. This didn't appear like a robbery. Valalong agreed that something was wrong, unlike the first policeman who completed that welfare check. Because as he walked about, he saw clues that Dorothy had not planned to leave her home or had left quickly. A half-empty glass of wine was in the kitchen, and the bedroom TV was on. If someone was leaving for a long time, those wouldn't be... From what Patricia informed them, he could rule out a family emergency or last-minute travel because Patricia had called around and nothing had happened. Valalong stopped going around the house and asked Patricia about Dorothy's mental health. Patricia hesitated before telling Valalong that Dorothy was on a lot of medication, which occasionally made her mental condition murky. Valalong naturally thought, okay, maybe she left the house alone in a fog. After going outdoors, something happened. Animal, human, or foul anything may have happened. He knew the back door had been unlocked during the initial police welfare check, and even though it was jammed, it hadn't prevented them from entering. Maybe that door always got stuck, and that's all that happened. It was common for the rear door to jam when she left. Valalong told his partner about his theory that Dorothy might leave alone. He remarked, "Hey, she's clearly not here. Let's go out there and search the grounds and see if we can find her." Valalong visited Strada's office 15 days later at 7 a.m. on the 3rd of May, 1985, to update him on the case. Valalong believed foul play was likely at this time. Dorothy was gone, and there was no proof of what happened to her after several searches of her home and property. Patricia said Dorothy had a cross tattoo on her left index finger. Valalong had spent the last 2 weeks calling local hospitals and morgues to determine if any women had that marking. Valalong also interrogated Dorothy's neighbors and the bank tellers she visited before disappearing. He also interviewed town residents who knew her. He even found Dorothy's new handyman, Kenny Palmier, who the bank had confirmed drove her around the day she disappeared. Since Dorothy disappeared 20 days ago, neither of these folks had heard from her, nor Patricia. Even though nobody knew where Dorothy was and couldn't help the investigation, Valalong seemed to gather that everyone he spoke to disliked Dorothy. That she was a recluse, mad, had murdered her husbands, and buried them in the pet cemetery, and that her house and land were haunted. These rumors wouldn't help the case. Valalong found it intriguing that people thought this of her. Valalong's only lead came from chatting to Dorothy's lawyer a few days earlier. The lawyer said Dorothy was in a bitter property rights battle with Bonnie and Brandon Nadir, former workers. Dorothy's active litigation was a warning signal as her case was increasingly turning into an abduction or homicide. Valalong knew he had to talk to Bonnie and Brandon. However, Strada's phone rang while Valalong informed him at his desk. When Strada took it up and listened on the other end, he seemed shocked. Strada thanked the caller, disconnected up, and informed Valalong that a body had been found in the Mississippi River 40 miles downriver the day before. They suspected Dorothy. A few hours later, Valalong and Strada stood with Patricia Newman in a coroner's exam room. A long metal table sat in front of them. The river-found woman's body was on this table. Patricia was invited in to identify Dorothy. Valalong didn't see how Patricia could do that after seeing the body. The body was swollen and decaying. The medical examiner estimated this woman was in the water for weeks. Due to the body's severe deterioration, any autopsy findings were likely a guess. Nothing else was certain except that it was a homicide. The woman was found with a plastic bag over her head and many hefty shackles, perhaps to prevent her body from floating up and being detected. Valalong looked at Patricia, who was plainly nervous as she examined the body. It seemed to overwhelm her. Shaking and gaping, she was horrified. She spoke after seeing the body. She denied it was Dorothy. Valalong was briefly disappointed. For the case, he wanted to find Dorothy, not because he wanted her dead, but suddenly he remembered. He approached the body. Wearing gloves, he gently checked the woman's left hand. The cross tattoo was barely visible on her index finger. Dorothy was this. 4 days later, on May 7, Valalong started his day at his desk. Since he was investigating a homicide, he had plenty to do. The autopsy examiner found no water in Dorothy's lungs. Thus, they concluded that strangulation or suffocation, not drowning, caused the fatality. Valalong knew Dorothy may have been kidnapped and killed. Now that it was official, he was checking the case notes from the beginning to see if anything was missed while this was still a missing persons case. He began at Dorothy's last known location, her house. Dorothy's house was immaculate. Possible Dorothy was enticed from home and killed elsewhere. Valalong knew from her neighbors and Patricia that Dorothy was naturally introverted and rarely left her house. His best guess was that Dorothy was slain in her home and that the crime scene was so clean because she was overwhelmed fast. Since Kenny Palmier was the last person to see Dorothy alive when he dropped her off at her home at 4 p.m., Valalong initially suspected him. Valalong rechecked Kenny and discovered a good alibi. Valalong didn't know Kenny's motive, even if he didn't have an alibi. Dorothy had no trace of a robbery in her residence, and she didn't seem to have much money. She lacked wealth. She died by strangulation or suffocation, which is personal. That person would have needed a good cause. Valalong has not yet spoken to anyone with a major Dorothy issue. People had ideas about her, but they mostly said to avoid her because she lives on haunted land and killed her husbands. Everything seemed like local rumors. Nobody seemed to have a specific issue with her. That lawsuit with the Naughtiers over her property rights remained. Valalong wasn't sure if this case was about actual animosity. He had not seen that. The lack of evidence was Valalong's main issue at this point. There were no witnesses, and they'd searched Dorothy's house repeatedly without success. Dorothy's body was forensic-free. Her body had been in the sea for so long that all forensics were gone. However, a knock on the door brought an officer in who told Valalong he had something he should see. Valalong got up and walked over. The officer stated they hauled him in for writing bad checks, and Dorothy Thompson was his former employer. Valalong was immediately curious and requested additional information. The officer said Elkin Childress had been Dorothy's live-in nanny for 2 months last fall. Elkin informed the officers who arrested him that he intended to labor at Dorothy's pet graveyard to uncover the riches. The story that Dorothy buried hundreds of thousands of dollars on her land joined the others. Elkin was preoccupied with finding it. He claimed he never did. When Valalong heard this, his heart raced. He'd never heard this treasure tale, but it wasn't weirder than any other Dorothy rumor. If Elkin wanted this wealth so much, he might have forced Dorothy to tell him where it was. The officer warned Valalong not to get too excited because Elkin had a valid alibi for the night Dorothy went missing. However, the officer stated Elkin mentioned something more that could enhance the inquiry. Elkin claims that Dorothy's acquaintance befriended her to inherit everything she owned. Her name was Patricia Newman. When the officer mentioned that, Valalong thought, why didn't I see this before? Patricia had contacted the police. In the beginning, she zealously pursued this probe, which Valalong assumed was because she concerned for her companion. He was now wondering if she was lying to appear innocent. Killers often join investigations to seem cooperative or put suspicion on others. Patricia entered Dorothy's residence several times before her body was located, giving her the chance to engage with the scene and hide evidence. Valalong turned and ran for Strata. Patricia must be spoken to immediately. This time, as a suspect. 6 days after Dorothy's body was found in the river, Valalong met with her close friend Patricia Newman again on May 8th. This time, the meeting was in a police interrogation room. Valalong watched Patricia intently at the interrogation table. She was both furious and anxious about being brought in. Hand fidgeting was especially noticeable. Valalong had carefully analyzed his approach. Since Patricia could have been lying to him, he started out nice to fool her into thinking everything she said was true. He would then surprise her with a sudden left turn to witness her reaction. He started with background inquiries regarding Patricia's connection with Dorothy and nodded appreciatively as Patricia described how they were good friends and how Patricia took care of Dorothy. However, Valalong unexpectedly asked her about Dorothy's estate and its value. She stated Dorothy owned the house and land, therefore no mortgages. It must be worth something, but she didn't know how much. Okay, forget the financial worth of the property. Is the property worth something to you, Patricia? Valalong replied. Valalong saw Patricia realize what was happening. She looked worried, as if she was beginning to realize she was being treated like a suspect rather than a witness. Patricia swiftly said no, the property was not worth anything to her. She didn't want it, not at all. But she turned it around on Valalong, saying, look, if you're looking for someone who does want that property, well, you ought to speak to the Naughtiers. Valalong now understood her reference. They were in that lawsuit with Dorothy before she disappeared and was found dead. but Valalong didn't speak. He looked at Patricia and said, "Oh, explain what you mean." Patricia told him the Nadirs had been Dorothy's live-in employees for years and were monsters. Dorothy said Brandon verbally abused her while working for her. He was also one of the major people propagating tales about Dorothy in town, including that she killed her husbands, her land was haunted, and she was mad. However, she indicated that wasn't the worst. Brandon was a thief, she alleged. She stated Brandon and his wife Bonnie had convinced Dorothy to sign away her property to them for nothing the year before, when she was on more depression medication than usual and not in sound mind. It hit Valalong then. He knew about the land lawsuit, but he didn't know the details. He simply understood there was a dispute. He also knew that Dorothy's lawyer had mentioned the Nadirs days earlier, but that was before Dorothy's body arrived and things were frantic, so Valalong hadn't followed up with her lawyers yet. He didn't realize how ugly this legal dispute was. Patricia said she urged Dorothy to hire a lawyer and fight because what they were doing to her was wrong. Dorothy had done it. She had a lawyer and a court date with the Nadirs 10 days before she disappeared. Valalong seemed astonished as he listened. This was evident and always in front of him. Dorothy's disappearance benefits the Nadirs. Clearly, the parties had beef. Valalong changed tactics at this point. He promised to talk to Patricia instead of treating her as a suspect. Valalong talked to Patricia longer. She remained suspect. Valalong was close to Dorothy, an older woman with no apparent heirs, but she hadn't seen her will. He wouldn't be surprised if Patricia was there. If true, she would have benefited from Dorothy's death like the Nadirs. However, Valalong knew he owed the Nadirs a conversation. He would call them next. 3 days later, Valalong was back in the precinct's interrogation room in the afternoon on May 10. But it was busier this time. He found 3 one-year-old Brandon Nadir for an interview. Brandon had consented to talk to Valalong, but he insisted on having his lawyer there, which instantly suggested he had something to hide. Since talking to Patricia, Valalong discovered Brandon's criminal history, including assault. Valalong also heard from town residents that Brandon had trouble keeping his mouth shut. He tended to threaten or attack others anytime he was even slightly irritated. Hothead and loudmouth. Given this, Valalong expected Brandon to be defensive or aggressive in this interview. Brandon didn't seem furious when Valalong asked him about Dorothy's contentious case. Instead, he appeared bewildered. He said it was all a great misunderstanding. Brandon stated he and his wife lived with Dorothy for 6 years. He assumed Dorothy considered them family. That's also why he thought she was selling her land cheaply, similar to a family discount. He said she seemed to want them to take her property. Brandon and his wife demanded payment. Brandon claimed the transaction was flawless until Patricia Newman got involved. Brandon sounded frustrated as he explained how he didn't know what happened, but Patricia had convinced Dorothy that he and Bonnie had taken advantage of her. Brandon claimed that didn't happen. That didn't happen. Brandon thought Patricia was exploiting Dorothy. He then added that Patricia was staying with Dorothy and they would argue, and Patricia would become upset at Dorothy and Dorothy would flee to the Nadir's house for protection. He stated Patricia was generally bad and Dorothy had to flee from her. Hearing this, Valalong wasn't sure what to think. Brandon may have lied, but he seemed believable. Additionally, Brandon didn't seem smart enough to be a master manipulator. Brandon appeared quite dense. It was hard to think he could do this murder without leaving any evidence or witnesses and then make up this fantastic story about Patricia being the real culprit. Bonnie, Brandon's wife, was also suspicious. It was possible that she was the leader and Brandon just followed. They were divorced, but if they were involved in this litigation with Dorothy, they may have worked together to get Dorothy out. Valalong wouldn't rule out Brandon as a suspect yet. He needed additional proof to link him to the crime. He informed Brandon he could leave and will contact him. Valalong watched Brandon and his lawyer leave the room. Valalong couldn't understand why somebody would kill Dorothy a few days before, which was darkly amusing. Now, Dorothy's friends Elkin, Patricia, and the Naughtiers wanted her money and would gain if she left. Now, he had to determine who wanted Dorothy gone most. Valalong and Sergeant Strata stared in stunned awe in Dorothy's pet graveyard 5 months later in October 1985. Because practically every tombstone was broken around them. Valalong didn't know who did it, but it fit. As with the cemetery, Valalong's homicide case was a complete disaster. Valalong and others had questioned Patricia and Brandon Nadir several times since May. But they always blamed the other. The two main suspects in Dorothy's murder were now fighting over her property. After Dorothy's will was read, Patricia Newman got a large portion of her wealth, including cemetery profits. But the Naughtiers said, no, you can't give that to Patricia because Dorothy had signed over the property and business to them. Even the acrimonious case to overturn that sale had not been settled. You can't pass it to Patricia. Additionally, Brandon's ex-wife, Bonnie Nadir, had moved into Dorothy's house, complicating matters. That's why the St. T. Bernard Sheriff's Department and State Police are at the pet cemetery. Patricia tried to get inside the house to grab Dorothy's possessions, but Bonnie wouldn't let her. Uniformed officers have just arrived to ensure everyone played nicely. But Valalong and Strata had come to ask Bonnie some questions. Bonnie remained a suspect in Dorothy's murder, but investigators had yet to question her. Perhaps this was their chance, Valalong thought. When they arrived, Bonnie was furious and refused to speak to anyone, telling the officers and Patricia to leave her property. Even though the cops and Patricia got inside and Patricia took what she needed, Bonnie wouldn't talk to them. She declined. Valalong and Strata headed back to their vehicle past all these damaged tombstones, annoyed that they had several suspects and no way to eliminate them. Brandon Nadir would benefit from Dorothy's death since his case would be dropped and he would inherit her land. Patricia said he was abusive to Dorothy while they lived together and had a criminal record. Bonnie, Brandon's ex-wife, was named in that lawsuit and had complete control of Dorothy's house when she died, so she might have aided him. She plainly wanted to live there. Patricia may have been prompted to remove Dorothy from the picture because she was named in the will. She'd been controlling of Dorothy and constantly intervened in the probe. Elkin Childress, the handyman, had been dismissed by his alibi, but Valalong thought he warranted further look. His obsession with discovering treasure on Dorothy's property was admitted. All the gravestones were suddenly shattered, suggesting he had returned and was trying to find the gold. Maybe they were inside gravestones. However, if they were going to consider Elkin as a suspect, then everyone who heard about Dorothy's wealth was a suspect. Since St. Bernard locals gossiped about Dorothy, it seemed like everyone in town was a suspect. Valalong didn't think they could connect anyone to this incident without forensic proof or witnesses. Still, he and Strata returned to the station in the cruiser to continue. For weeks and months, the investigators interviewed suspects and Dorothy's friends. They met a psychic who claimed to know the killer. Some folks called in to report seeing Dorothy's ghost and followed up to see if she was there. However, nothing happened. None of it provided police with new evidence to bring someone to court. Dorothy's case changed hands several times before turning cold. Detective John Duran did paperwork at his St. Bernard's Police Precinct desk on a Thursday afternoon in late September 2009, 24 years later. Duran placed his pen down and sat back in his chair to take a breather when another investigator entered and said, "Hey, the caller was on the phone." Duran knew who he was talking about. An anonymous caller tipped us about the 1,985 murder of the pet cemetery owner a few days earlier. Duran immediately knew the caller was talking about Dorothy Thompson. When he was 15, Duran cut the pet cemetery grass. He and his buddies knew about Dorothy, the eccentric recluse who may have murdered people and died one day. In the initial call, the tipster was frightened and hung up without saying his name. When Duran answered the phone, he said, "Whoever this is, you're not going to get in any trouble here. We just want your name and your location." I want to come talk to you and just hear what you know. Can you do that? The caller reluctantly agreed. Duran and another investigator sat in a New Orleans living room across from a fidgety older man later that day. The man kept scanning the room and glanced over his shoulder as if someone was about to spring out. Duran saw that this guy didn't seem apprehensive about spilling the facts. He seems truly scared. After taking a deep breath, the man revealed he had known who killed Dorothy for years. Knowing guilt was actually haunting him. He told the cops he saw Dorothy's chained ghost and asked him to come forward. Duran raised his eyebrows skeptically but didn't respond. The narrative started off strange and hard to believe. However, it didn't matter why he came forward. What he said mattered. Duran and his partner waited with an open mind. After much fear and timidity, the old man finally said what he knew. A decades-long inquiry and various confessions have led investigators to reconstruct Dorothy Thompson's the 13th of April 1985 night. Brandon Nautier drove his pickup up Dorothy's long, twisting path through the woods after 9 that night. Brandon watched the scenery out the window as he drove. All the tombstones, trees, the house ahead, and the grounds. He decided to stop waiting for his wealth. He must take it. Dorothy did not deserve this, he believed. Brandon believed Dorothy wasn't worthy of life. Brandon arrived outside Dorothy's house. After parking his truck, he calmly walked around the house to the rear. He knocked. Dorothy reached the door. She spotted Brandon through the glass. She opened the door despite seeming bewildered. After she did, Brandon didn't hesitate. He jumped on her. Dorothy tried to scream, but he grabbed her throat and silenced her. Then, he silently strangled Dorothy until she stopped moving. Brandon wrapped Dorothy in sheets after she was motionless on the ground. She was hauled outside to his truck. After putting Dorothy's body in the vehicle, he drove to the Mississippi River near her house. Brandon exited. He bound Dorothy's hands and feet. He also covered her head with a plastic bag in case. Heavy chains were then placed on her body. After preparing her, Brandon calmly lifted her, strolled to the Mississippi River's brink, and flung her in. Brandon returned to his pickup and drove off, feeling better than in months. After Dorothy left, all his issues were solved. Brandon Nautier killed Dorothy Thompson. Dorothy was fooled into giving him her land at a low price, and Patricia encouraged her to sue him when she realized he had duped her. Brandon thought, okay, if I kill Dorothy before this lawsuit is completed, they'll figure out that this was unfair and that I con her, so the charges go dropped and the sale goes to me. My property. Brandon had company the night of the murder. He invited another of Dorothy's previous handymen, James Tregler, to wait in the car with him. So he did it. Brandon was quite violent. Therefore, he would have killed Dorothy to drop the lawsuit. However, Brandon was known for his big mouth and told all his friends what he did. This awful incident was known to all of Brandon's friends. They trusted him because they knew he could commit severe violence, but they were afraid of him. Thus, none of the companions revealed their knowledge. Finally, one of these buddies came forward because they were plagued by this crime. The anonymous caller informed the detectives. Brandon wasn't acting alone, he said. Others included James Tregler. After 4 years, detectives spoke to James Tregler, who confessed to being there that night thanks to that tip. They had enough evidence to charge Brandon with murder. Brandon pleaded guilty to Dorothy's murder in 2012 and received a 10-year sentence. Brandon's ex-wife Bonnie wasn't participating. James Tregler, the other handyman who drove with Brandon the night of the murder, constantly denied knowing it would happen. His evidence earned him immunity from prosecution. The pet cemetery remains, although it's abandoned and overgrown. Treasure hunters keep walking the site with metal detectors in hopes of finding the treasure. Many thanks for viewing. Comment your thoughts about today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. On the morning of the 26th of June 1826, Samuel Willie Jr. opened his front door and immediately realized how close his family had come to dying. Overnight, a violent storm had torn through New Hampshire's White Mountains with such force that it looked like the entire mountain had exploded around their home. The river in front of the house had burst over its banks. Entire trees had been ripped out of the ground. Thick mud and shattered rock covered the property in every direction. Standing beside him in stunned silence, his wife Polly whispered something Sam did not want to admit might be true. Moving their family into this isolated mountain pass may have been a terrible mistake. Just a year earlier, Sam had abandoned the ordinary life of a farmer to chase something bigger. Deep in a dangerous stretch of wilderness known only as the Notch, he believed he could build a famous inn for travelers, artists, and adventurers passing through the White Mountains. But now, as he stared at the devastation left behind by the storm, that dream suddenly felt fragile. Because what frightened Sam most was not the destruction itself. It was the terrifying realization that the mountain behind their home had nearly killed them once already and might not miss the next time. And that wasn't all. The sheer volume of water had also triggered a rock slide from the steep mountain slopes that loomed right behind their house. So now, their yard and the adjacent fields were littered with huge rocks, thick mud, and entire trees that had been ripped from the ground, roots and all. As Sam's eyes scanned the devastation, he did see a small silver lining. Luckily, the main path of the slide had missed their house and the barn where they kept their livestock. But it had only missed them by a few feet. It was an incredibly close call. Even so, the structures themselves had sustained damage from the wind and the rain of the storm itself. Windows were cracked, shingles were missing. He knew he would have to repair all of it. So, Sam stood there, 100 thoughts racing through his mind, trying to calculate how much time and, more importantly, how much money it was going to take to clean all of this up. It seemed like an impossible task. And as he was thinking, he heard Polly next to him mumble quietly to herself that this had all been a really bad idea. Sam let out a long sigh. He knew exactly what she was talking about. She was referring to their decision to move their entire family out here to the Notch in the first place. And at that very moment, staring at the awful destruction that was laid out right in front of him, he had to admit that she was probably right. This might have been a terrible, terrible idea. You see, up until about a year before this, Sam and Polly and their 5 children had lived a very different life. They had a small farm about 20 miles away from where they were standing now. It had been a quiet life, a cozy life. But Sam had always had this nagging feeling deep down that he was meant for something more. He wanted to do something more exciting, more ambitious than just being a regular old farmer. And when he saw this house in the Notch, he thought he had found it. He saw an opportunity for a grand adventure and also a pretty good opportunity to make some real money. In this part of the White Mountain Range, there was a single road, about 12 miles long, that cut directly through the range from one side to the other. And the Notch house, their house, was located almost exactly in the middle of that long road. But you have to remember, this was the year 1826. So when we say road, it was really more like a glorified trail. It was mountainous, it was rocky, and it was so treacherous that neither horses nor wagons could make it all the way through without stopping. Because of this, travelers were typically on foot, and there was literally nowhere for them to stop and rest on that entire 12-mile stretch of road. Nowhere, that is, except for the Willie's Notch house. Sam had realized right away how valuable this property could be. If he could just fix it up and convert it into an inn, it would be the only place for travelers to get a hot meal and a warm bed. But he had even bigger aspirations for the place, beyond it just being a simple pit stop. He wanted to turn it into a true destination. After all, the White Mountains were known for being incredibly beautiful. And the specific spot where the Willies lived, in the Notch, was no exception. Their house was situated right on a riverbank, nestled in a deep mountain valley. It was surrounded on all sides by dense woods and towering, mist-covered peaks. It was honestly a breathtaking view. And as soon as Sam had first laid eyes on it, he knew. He knew that this place could become a famous destination for poets and authors and artists. It was the kind of place people would write songs and books about. In his mind, it was absolutely perfect. But so far, his dream of making a life out here at the Notch House had been a whole lot of hard work. The house itself was large, but it was really old. And it had been completely abandoned for quite a while before he and his family had moved in. So it was in really bad shape, quite dilapidated. To help with the massive amount of work, Sam had hired 2 men to live on the property and help him fix it up. And together they had already done some significant work to expand the house and the barn to be able to accommodate more travelers. But Sam knew he still had a very long way to go before the Notch House could be considered some kind of artist's retreat. And now, with this extensive new damage from the most recent storm, he had even more things to add to his never-ending list of repairs. But he also had to admit to himself that the property damage was actually the least of his problems. Because as he and his wife Polly stood there, looking around at the aftermath of the storm, he knew that deep down, he was lucky. He was lucky their house was even still standing. He was lucky that he and his family were even still alive. That storm had been catastrophic. And as Sam thought about how close they had all come to death, his heart began to race. He started to wonder if maybe Polly was right. Maybe they really should just pack up the family, abandon this dream, and go back to the simple, safe life of farming. But leaving felt like admitting failure. His big dream would be over before it even really began. There would be no artist retreat, no tourist mecca. He wouldn't be some creative benefactor. He would just be a farmer again. So he took a deep breath, turned to his wife, and asked her to please just give this place one more chance. He promised her that he would do everything he possibly could to not just repair the property, but to make it safe and secure so it could withstand whatever the mountain decided to throw at them next. And Polly, she hesitated for a moment. But ultimately, she believed in her husband. She trusted him. And so she nodded in agreement. For the next 2 months, Sam and his 2 hired workers labored practically around the clock. They worked from sunup to sundown, repairing all the damage from the storm. They fixed up broken windows and replaced missing shingles. They cleared away all the rocks and fallen trees, which was an exhausting task that took forever. And then, once all the immediate repairs were finally done, Sam kept working. But now he focused his energy on improving the property, on making it stronger. As the weeks turned into a month, and then 2, he worked tirelessly to build his family a truly secure home. He wanted them to be much safer against any future storms. He reinforced the walls of the house and built a whole new, stronger roof. He even started to map out different disaster scenarios in his mind so that no matter what happened, he and his family would always be prepared. One particular disaster scenario that he was especially concerned about was the large boulder that was situated on the mountainside directly behind their house. It was a massive piece of granite the size of a small cottage. He was worried that if there was another big rock slide, that boulder might just break free, topple onto their home, and crush them all in an instant. He and his workers tried to figure out a way to move it, but they soon realized that was impossible. The boulder was just way too big, too heavy. But in the end, they found a very creative way to make sure it would not be a danger to them. And while Sam did all of this hard work, he started to feel a lot better about everything. Each security measure he put in place, every new nail he hammered, was proof to him that he didn't have to sacrifice his ambitions for his family's safety. He could have both. A few weeks later, on the night of August 28th, Samuel Willey stood by a downstairs window watching another wild storm rage outside. Heavy rain was pummeling the glass, and Sam could hear the powerful wind battering the sides of the house, making the whole structure groan. It was pitch black outside, but every now and then, a brilliant burst of lightning would flash across the sky, lighting up the entire valley for a few terrifying seconds before it plunged back into darkness again. And each time this happened, a deafening crash of thunder would follow, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the house right down to its very foundation. Behind Sam, in the kitchen, Polly was gathered with their 5 children and the 2 men that were working on the property. They were all sitting around the kitchen table. Polly and the kids, in particular, were very, very scared. The whole group of them were reading Bible verses out loud, their voices trembling in these frantic, hushed tones. It was like they were trying to will the storm to be over, trying to cling on to their faith and pray that they would all be okay. Sam could hear the fear in his wife's voice, and he really couldn't blame her. This was quite possibly the strongest storm that either of them had ever seen out here. It was even bigger, even more violent than the one that had completely destroyed their property over the summer. The rain seemed impossibly powerful, coming down so hard and so fast that the river had already overflowed its banks. And each time there was a flash of lightning, Sam could see that the water levels were getting higher and higher almost by the second. And so Sam, he was admittedly quite scared himself. He was trying to keep it hidden, to be the strong father and husband, but his heart was racing and he was deeply anxious. But at the same time, he told himself that this was the moment he had prepared for all summer long. This was it. He had done so much work to make sure this house was a safe place during storms, and he felt like they should be okay. But at the same time, the deafening sounds from outside and the terrified voices of Polly and his children were making it really, really hard to believe that was actually true, that they were really safe here. So for a little while, Sam just kept his vigil, looking out the window, listening to his family praying behind him. But then eventually, he turned around, and as calmly as he possibly could, he told them all to go to bed. He said it was going to be fine. He would stay up and keep watch through the night. Polly, who was visibly still very scared, just nodded. She got up and went off with the kids. And for the next few hours, Sam stayed at his post by the window and watched the storm. And for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of drama. I mean, it was incredibly loud and windy. It was obvious the river was flooding. He knew there was going to be more damage to clean up tomorrow. But Sam was starting to think that, maybe they were going to get through this thing. But then, a little after midnight, Sam heard a sudden, extremely loud banging sound from outside. He froze, because he knew instantly it was not thunder. It sounded more like a huge explosion. Almost immediately, Sam knew what it had to have been. The barn. The barn must have collapsed. And the thought that this storm had just taken out an entire building, a building that he himself had reinforced, turned Sam's worry into outright panic. And so Sam screamed for his wife and the workers and his kids to wake up. He yelled that it wasn't safe. Get away from the windows. We have to find cover. And so for the next few seconds, the family and the workers, all 9 of them, were frantically scrambling around the house in the dark trying to find a safe spot, but they didn't know where it was. But as they were sort of navigating through the chaos, trying to find the right place to go to weather the storm, Sam heard an even louder bang. And then there were screams all around him. And then he felt himself go airborne as a heavy object slammed into his back. The following evening, an exhausted traveler named John Barker walked down that very same road, heading in the direction of the Notch house where the Willies lived. John was a merchant, and he was passing through the White Mountains on his way home after a long business trip. He had made this trip many times before, so he knew the road well. But the road he was on now was barely recognizable. It was flooded in many places, and there were rock slides and debris everywhere. The journey was slow-going and pretty miserable. But he knew that at the halfway point was this house, the Notch house, where Sam Willie and his family lived. He knew they were in the process of converting their house into an inn for travelers. And even though it wasn't fully established yet, John was confident that he could probably get into that house, get a hot meal, and rest for a little while before he had to make the rest of his journey. But when he finally rounded the corner into the valley where the house was, he just froze. The entire area was a complete disaster. The river had clearly and completely flooded, and now half the land in front of him was just underwater. There had also clearly been a huge rock slide. The barn was only half standing, a skeleton of what it once was. and the field in front of the Willies' home was completely buried in tons of rocks and other mountain debris. But the truly astonishing thing was that right in the middle of all this destruction and ruin, the Willies' house was still standing. And as John carefully maneuvered his way closer to it, he realized it was more than just intact. The house was pristine. There wasn't a single thing broken or out of place on it. Not even a single window pane was cracked. Relieved and a little bit amazed by this miracle, John hurried right up to the entrance and knocked loudly. But no one answered. So eventually, he just turned the knob, found the door was unlocked, and opened it. He poked his head in and called out to Sam. But he didn't hear anything. No sound of a reply, and no sound of anyone moving around inside. So John tentatively stepped all the way into the house and just kept calling out to the family as he walked from room to room. But he quickly realized the house was completely empty. It was also a bit of a mess. There were clothes scattered all over the floor, and the beds and sheets had been yanked around and were messy. And on the kitchen table, the family Bible was wide open. John stood there in the middle of the empty home, trying to work out what could have possibly happened here. The mess suggested that, clearly the family had been here somewhat recently, but they must have left in a great hurry. So John guessed that they must have gone down the mountain to wait out the storm somewhere else, maybe at a neighbor's house or at the tavern that was miles away at the end of the road. And since the Willies were not here to give him permission to stay, John needed to figure out what he was going to do. He didn't really like the idea of sleeping in their home without them there, but he really had nowhere else to go. It was almost nighttime, and he could barely manage the ruined road during the daylight, let alone in the dark. So, even though he felt kind of bad about it, he picked a bed and tried to get some rest. But just as he began to drift off to sleep, he heard a deep, guttural moaning sound coming from somewhere outside the house. John immediately shot up, fully awake, and rushed over to a window. But he couldn't see anything. Night came really fast in the White Mountains, and it was now almost completely dark outside. He waited, listening, to see if he would hear anything else, but he didn't. So he decided he must have imagined the sound, and he turned to go back to bed. But as he did, the moaning started again, and this time it was louder, closer. John gasped as a terrible thought occurred to him. He wondered if maybe that sound was one of the Willies. He wondered if maybe they hadn't actually left the property after all, but were maybe outside somewhere, injured or in trouble because of the storm. So John sprinted outside into the darkness. But again, it was pitch black, and he didn't have any kind of light to help guide his way. And so once he was out there, he just began shouting, calling out to whoever it was, asking if they needed help. And eventually, the horrible moaning sound answered him. But the sound kind of echoed all over the valley, so John couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, other than it was clearly outside somewhere in the debris. After frantically looking around and not finding whoever it was, John realized that finding the injured person was going to be impossible right now. It was just too dark. And he would unfortunately have to wait until the morning. So, very reluctantly, John went back inside the house. And for hours, he just sat there in bed and listened to the pained moaning continue outside. Finally, in the morning, when the first bit of sun peeked over the mountain ridge, John hurried right back outside to look around. And this time, he very quickly found the source of that moaning sound. It was one of the Willies' oxen. It was moaning in pain from being trapped under some heavy debris near the ruins of their barn. John immediately rushed forward and began hauling the heavy wooden planks and rocks off the poor animal. And after he had finally freed the ox, it amazingly staggered to its feet and just hobbled away into the woods. It was basically okay. But after it was gone, John felt this sort of sick uneasiness settle over him. Even though the sound had just been from an ox and he had saved it, he just felt like there was something deeply wrong here. And so he decided that he had to go and see the Willies with his own eyes just to make sure they really were okay. So, even though it was really early and John was still very tired, he immediately gathered up his things and set off down the ruined road. Hours later, around noon that same day, John Barker finally staggered out of the mostly destroyed mountain pass and made his way towards the tavern at the bottom of the road. When John stepped inside, he was utterly exhausted. He was drenched from the awful journey he had just taken. But more than that, he was really worried about the Willie family. Because as he had made that trip down the road, he had passed by the neighbors' homes along the way, and he had kind of expected to see the Willies taking shelter in one of them. But no, the Willies were not in any of the neighbors' homes. And in fact, basically none of the neighbors were in their houses either. They were all here, in this tavern. It was like everybody who lived on this road had come to this tavern to wait out the storm. But when John looked around the crowded room, he could tell right away that the Willies were not there either. And this made John's stomach drop. Because if they weren't at their house, and they weren't in any of the neighbors' homes, and now they were not in this tavern with the rest of their neighbors, that had to mean something was very wrong. And so John actually called out to the entire room and asked if anyone had seen the Willies since the storm. And the tavern got really quiet as all of its occupants all began looking around at each other, seeing if anybody had any information. But eventually, everyone just shook their head and said, "No, we don't know where they are." And that's when John said to the crowd that, well, the Willies are missing. A few hours later, a 12-man search party left that tavern and headed right back up the road towards the Notch. They were led by one of the Willies' neighbors, a man named Edward Melcher, who lived at the base of the mountain on a farm with his family. The recent storm had done quite a bit of damage to Edward's property as well. And so he and his family, like most other people that lived in this area, had gone to the tavern to seek shelter. Edward and his family, much like the Willies, were good people who were just trying to carve out a living in this harsh part of the world, and there were not a lot of people doing that. This was a very small, tight-knit community. And so they always helped each other out whenever they could. And so, this was no exception. But, as desperately as Edward and the rest of the search party wanted to get to the Willies' property and find these people, it took them so long to navigate the destroyed road that by the time they actually got to the property, it was after midnight and really too dark to look for anything. So they just went right into the Willies' house to wait until morning. Once he was inside, Edward could see that the home really was just as John Barker had described it. It was sort of a mess inside, but there was absolutely no damage to it from the storm. Edward had heard that Sam was really freaked out about a storm that they had had earlier that summer. And because of that storm and because of the damage it had done, he had gone way out of his way to really develop his property to prepare it for the next big storm. And it seemed like all of his preparations and all the reinforcements on his land had paid off, because here his house was, standing tall and completely unharmed. But that was also kind of confusing. It's like, if you prepared this house so well for a storm, and clearly it was able to withstand the storm, why on earth did the Willies leave? As Edward continued to walk around the silent house, he saw that the Willies' Bible was still lying on the kitchen table, wide open. And when he leaned over and read the passage that was on the page, he couldn't help but shiver when he saw what it said. It said, "The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire." Hours later, when the sun finally began to come up, Edward and the others went outside and began searching the devastated property for any sign of the Willies. And over the next few hours, the original party of 12 grew as more and more people showed up to assist in the search. By this point, word had spread pretty far about the family's disappearance, and so residents from all over the White Mountains had come here to help. And eventually, hundreds of people were combing the mountainside, looking for the Willies, or at least to find a single clue about where they might have gone. At around noon, when still absolutely nothing had been found, Edward decided he would go search closer to the river, since by this point the water levels had gone down some. And when he got to the water's edge, he began to hear this strange, low buzzing sound. And so he followed it. And eventually, he saw something poking out from behind some debris. And when he saw what it was, Edward began to scream for help. The thing that Samuel Willie was most afraid of happening in a large storm was a massive rock slide, especially with that huge boulder positioned right behind his house. But when Sam realized it was going to be impossible to move that boulder or to otherwise shield his family from falling mountain rocks, he came up with what he thought was a pretty creative solution. He built a whole second, smaller shelter, a safe place that he and his family could run to if there was a bad storm. And when that second, more violent storm hit, the one that had caused all this damage and had led to the Willie's disappearance, well, during that storm, Sam had started screaming for his family to take cover, to get away from the windows. He had heard that crashing sound outside that he was convinced was the sound of his barn collapsing, and he was sure his house was next. He was yelling for them all to take cover. Well, the family listened to him. And together, all 9 of them did exactly what he said. They left the main house and they ran towards that second shelter, the one they believed was better protected from a potential rock slide. But unfortunately, this would be a catastrophic, fatal mistake. Because that humongous boulder that sat right behind the house, the one that Sam feared so much, was not actually a safety risk. In many ways, it was a protective barrier. When there was an actual massive rock slide during this horrible storm, all of the rubble, the rocks and trees and mud actually hit the backside of that giant boulder and split into 2 separate streams. The flow of the avalanche was diverted around the boulder, and in doing so, it did not strike the house at all. And so, in essence, this boulder that Sam had been so worried about basically made the Willie's original home the single safest place to be on the entire property. But unfortunately, Sam and his family did not stay there long enough to realize that. They ran out of the main house as a big group, and as soon as they were outside, they ran directly into the path of the rock slide and were all instantly killed. Eventually, the residents of the White Mountains would find the family. The buzzing that Edward had heard was actually a group of flies gathered around a single human hand that was reaching out from underneath the rubble. In the end, because of this immense tragedy, the area became a famous tourist destination, just like the Willies had originally hoped it would. People from all over the country heard about the family and what had happened to them. And before long, artists and authors were coming to the White Mountains in droves to see the site of the tragedy for themselves. And some of them even wrote books and poems about it. And so, in a sort of cruel twist of fate, Sam's dream did come true, just not in the way he ever could have hoped. On one of the last nights in December of 1678, a woman named Marie Bosse sat at a large table at a friend's dinner party in the city of Paris, France. The table was crowded with other party guests, and they were all listening intently to Marie as she told story after story about her life and her career. Marie was a fortune teller, which meant, at least according to her, that she could read people's futures, usually by looking at the lines on their palms or by using special crystals. And Marie was actually quite good at doing this, in the sense that whenever she told someone what their future was going to be, she was typically right. Which was why, out of the more than 400 other fortune tellers in Paris at the time, she had some of the best and most important clients in the whole city. People like members of royalty and the wives of very high-ranking government officials and other very wealthy people from high society. And it was a very big deal for Marie to even be in the same room as some of these kinds of people because she did not come from money. In fact, there was a time in her life where she had almost had to live out on the streets. Years ago, when her husband had died unexpectedly, she was left all alone with her 3 children and really no way to provide for them. But she had worked incredibly hard, and she had actually ended up thriving. Her kids were all grown up now, and she had turned her fortune-telling talents into a real, profitable business. She had been so successful, in fact, that she was really maybe just 3 new clients away from being able to retire comfortably. And Marie was not the kind of person to just sit back and wait for those clients to magically find her. She was a self-made woman, and she knew it was very important to go out and find those clients herself. And so, that's exactly why she was at this party tonight. It was being hosted by a friend of hers who was also in the fortune-telling scene. And so, many of the guests who were sitting at this table were new potential clients that Marie really hoped to impress. So that's what Marie was trying to do now, to be very impressive. She was telling the other guests all of these incredible tales about working with the rich and the famous. But the problem was, in addition to these fabulous stories she was telling, what was also coming through very clearly to her audience was that Marie was very, very drunk. Marie was a loud and talkative person in general. And that extrovert attitude really helped her get clients, typically. But when she got drunk, she was even more talkative than normal. And sometimes it also made her a little bit inappropriate. Right now, though, she felt like she was on a roll. Her stories were drawing gasps and laughs from the crowd, and the guests were pushing her to tell them more and more. But there was at least one person in the crowd that seemed to be bothered by what Marie was saying. It was the hostess of the party. The hostess kept silently glaring at Marie from the other end of the table. It was like she was trying to silently tell her to shut up. But Marie just figured she knew why the hostess was acting that way. The hostess was also a fortune teller, and so she must just be jealous. Marie was getting all of this attention and all these potential new clients, and this wasn't even her party. She had to be jealous. So Marie ignored the glares and just kept on talking until dinner was finally over. And then after that, the party ended, and Marie staggered off to bed. When Marie woke up the next day, her head was absolutely pounding and her stomach was in knots. She was severely hungover from all the drinking she had done the night before. She didn't remember a whole lot about what had happened, but she did remember telling a lot of stories. And she remembered that while she was telling these stories, the hostess was angrily glaring at her the entire time. And now that she was sober, a terrible thought popped into her head. She wondered if maybe she had said or done something that was embarrassing. What if the table wasn't laughing with her? What if they were laughing at her? And what if the hostess glaring at her was some sort of signal to stop because she was hurting herself? And so this thought that somehow she had done real damage to her reputation, to her career from being too drunk, continued to weigh on her throughout the entire day and into the following evening. Until that night, when she was in her kitchen making some dinner with her adult daughter, and there was a knock at her door. Marie hurried to open it up, and when she did, she found a young woman standing on her front steps. The woman seemed incredibly nervous. She kept fidgeting with her hands and smoothing down her hair. She told Marie that she had gotten her name from someone Marie had met at that dinner party, and she was hoping that Marie could help her. And when she heard this, Marie smiled and exhaled out all the tension that she had been holding on to for the last day. This was a huge relief to Marie. It was proof that the dinner party had not been a total embarrassment after all. Despite the hostess glaring at her the whole time, clearly, here she was, getting a new client. She must have impressed at least this one woman, and maybe there were more like her. The party had been a success. So, very excitedly, she invited the young woman inside and led her to the specific area of her home where Marie conducted her business and read people's fortunes. This room had lots of strange objects placed all around it, like jars filled with mysterious liquids, and crystals, and bottles of potions, and decks of cards, all designed to make the area feel mystical and authentic. The two of them eventually sat down at Marie's small table in the middle of this room. And once they were sitting, the woman told Marie that she did want her fortune told. She said she had a terribly abusive husband, and she wanted to know how much longer she would have to put up with his cruelty. This didn't surprise Marie at all. She had seen a lot of nervous, frail women just like this one, women who were completely trapped in their marriages. In France at this time, divorce wasn't even legal, which meant you were stuck with your partner for life, even if they were abusive. And so a lot of these women who were in this terrible position turned to Marie, desperate to be told what the rest of their lives looked like, and if their lives would continue to be so terrible and hard because of their partner. Marie knew that really, what these women were looking for was some sense of control. They hoped that if they just knew what their future looked like, even if it was bad, they could somehow do something to change it. And so Marie, she reached out and she gently grabbed this woman's hand. She turned it over and she began to study her palm. Marie was trying to get a sense of what the future held for this woman by reading the lines on her hand. And pretty soon, Marie got this feeling in her gut. She felt sure that this woman actually was going to be okay. And so Marie told the woman that her husband's abuse would end very soon. Then she gave her some tips on what to do in the meantime. The woman was visibly relieved and thanked Marie profusely. And then when she was gone, Marie smiled. Not just because she had helped this woman, but also because after this job, Marie would only need 2 more clients before she had enough money to finally retire. A few days later, on January 4th, Marie woke up to somebody banging on her door. She figured it must be a very desperate new client, so she rolled out of bed and started walking to go answer it. But before she could get there, the door flew open and the Parisian police poured inside. Marie staggered back and just stared at them in complete and total shock. She had no idea what they were doing there. But they immediately just grabbed her and told her she was under arrest. Marie screamed in protest and said there had to be some kind of mistake here. She hadn't done anything wrong. And when they didn't listen to her, she got furious and demanded to be released. She told them that she was Marie Boss, and that she had friends in high places, like in Parliament and in noble circles. She said they could all vouch for her, that she was an honest person who just worked hard and was good for her clients and good for the city. But as she was ranting and raving, one of the officers stepped in front of her. And without reacting at all to what she was saying, he just showed her an object that Marie instantly recognized as having come from her fortune-telling room. And at the sight of this object, her heart sank, and she stopped struggling. Because Marie knew that she was now in very, very big trouble. And if she was in trouble, then so were many, many other people in Paris. After Marie was arrested, she was brought to a prison in Paris called the Bastille, where she was interrogated by torture. And since Marie was already a talker by nature, she quickly told the police everything they wanted to know. And after Marie did that, all hell broke loose. Hordes of police officers fanned out through the entire city, charging into homes and businesses all around Paris, arresting civilians, business owners, and housewives. Then they flooded the hall of the city's government and demanded that high-ranking officials in Parliament surrender their wives to the authorities, throwing the entire Parisian government into absolute chaos. And even after all of that, the authorities still weren't finished. They left the city and began forcing members of the French nobility out of their castles to go and face charges in the city. Months turned into years, and the arrests continued to pile up, and each one was more shocking than the last. Until the investigation led authorities to the actual royal palace in Paris and to the king's own favorite mistress. By the time the police finally finished their investigation, hundreds of people all across France, ranging from commoners to literal royalty, were either facing serious charges or were sitting in jail cells. And screams filled the halls of these prisons as the arrested were tortured for whatever information they might have. Scores of people fled the country in terror. And then eventually, all around Paris, these enormous pyres were built in the public squares. And one by one, dozens and dozens of people were led out to these pyres, strapped to the poles in the middle of them, and then burned to death in front of thousands of Parisian spectators. And it was all because of Marie. So, Marie Boss was not just a fortune teller. She made her real money by making and selling poison. And it would turn out that she was not the only one. In fact, at the time, you could say that Paris basically ran on poison. Since the late 1660s, according to one estimate, around half of the people who lived in that city, from housewives to literal royalty, had either poisoned someone or had been poisoned by someone else. It had become absurdly common for people, especially rich people, to buy poison from Marie and the network of 400 or so other poisoners around the city and use it to quietly commit murder so that the victims' deaths looked natural. But poison was not just used to kill people. It was sort of used as a solution for many kinds of problems. Like people who wanted their romantic interests to be easier to seduce, well, they'd buy poison and use it on them. Or people that had abusive or unappealing partners, they would use poison to make them sick and bedridden because remember, they couldn't get divorced. So, if you were stuck with somebody and you didn't like them, well, you could just poison them. It was also alleged that King Louis XIV himself was being poisoned in non-fatal doses by his mistress, who wanted to make him easier to manipulate. Poison was even used for pure entertainment. One duo of poisoners baked deadly substances into cakes and then handed them out to unsuspecting patients at a local hospital just to see what would happen. The poison affair, as it came to be called, was without a doubt at the time Paris's biggest and best-kept secret. Until Marie went to that dinner party, got really drunk, and let it slip. That night, Marie had told stories of poisoning people, and the other guests thought they were so funny because they didn't believe they were true. But one of the guests saw that the hostess of the party looked furious at Marie the whole time Marie was telling these wild stories. And so he started to wonder if maybe what Marie was talking about might actually be real, and that the hostess was trying to signal her to stop talking about it. But Marie was not taking the hint. So the following day, that dinner guest went to the police. And the police sent a woman to Marie's house to act as an undercover spy to see if maybe she could get proof that the poisonings were real. And lo and behold, when this woman told Marie that her husband was abusive and she just wanted to know how long this was going to go on for, Marie, she read her palm and she read her future, but then she also gave her some tips about what to do in the meantime, which included handing her a vial of poison and saying, just go ahead and kill your husband. Poison him. The object that officer had shown Marie when she was arrested was that very same vial of poison. The investigation into the poison affair lasted for 3 years. And during that time, there were over 300 people who got arrested, from commoners all the way up to royalty. 23 of those people were banished from the country, and 34 people were executed, including Marie Boss. She was actually the first person to be burned alive on one of those pyres. Cases like these remind us that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world isn't evil, it's fear, desperation, or one terrible decision made at exactly the wrong moment. If you enjoyed today's episode, let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more strange and unsettling true stories, we have an entire playlist waiting for you right now. On the morning of the 8th of December, 1995, 41-year-old Bonnie Sanborn walked through her Tucson, Arizona home, believing she was dealing with the biggest problem in her life. She had no idea that within the next 24 hours, she would vanish from her own bedroom in one of the most violent crimes the city had seen that year. At the time, though, the morning felt ordinary. Her youngest son was already sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal. The television hummed softly somewhere in the house. Sunlight spilled through the windows. Bonnie moved down the hallway with a cup of coffee in her hand, trying to get her children ready for school before the morning chaos got any worse. She stopped briefly at her daughter Candace's room, reminding the 13-year-old to hurry up. Candace barely looked up from the mirror. Bonnie sighed and continued farther down the hallway toward her 15-year-old son Bradley's bedroom. The door was shut. And behind it, Bonnie was about to discover something so bizarre, so alarming, that it would completely change the course of the next 24 hours. She knocked on his door, a solid, firm knock. There was no answer. She knocked again, a little louder this time, and called his name. Still nothing. She raised her voice, shouting through the closed door that if he didn't get out of that bed, she was coming in there to drag him out herself. It was a threat she'd made before, but today she really meant it. Yet, there was still no response from inside the room. A flicker of worry mixed with her frustration. She pressed her ear against the cool wood of the door, listening for any sign of movement. She was hoping to hear the rustle of sheets or the sound of a dresser drawer opening and closing. But that's not what she heard. Instead, a strange sound reached her ears. It was a rhythmic clanking noise, a harsh metallic sound, like someone was banging metal against metal over and over again. It was completely out of place for a quiet suburban morning. Her curiosity and concern now overriding her anger, Bonnie turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The sight that greeted her made her stop dead in her tracks. There, in the middle of his bedroom floor, was her son, Bradley. And with him was his 18-year-old friend, Jason Horbachevsky. The two of them were crouched on the floor, sweat beading on their foreheads, using a crowbar and a hammer to try and pry open a large, heavy metal box. Bonnie stepped fully into the room, her eyes wide with disbelief. As she got a closer look, she realized what the box was. There was a phone receiver dangling off the side, its coiled cord twisted and broken. It was a payphone. A payphone that Bradley and Jason had very obviously stolen from somewhere on the street, and now they were trying to smash it open to get the quarters from inside. Bonnie was so completely shocked, so floored by the brazenness of it all, that the only words she could manage to get out were a quiet, "What are you doing?" Bradley looked up at his mom, his expression not one of guilt or fear, but of mild annoyance that he'd been interrupted. He just shrugged and said, "What?" "We're just trying to get the change out of this payphone," as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Before Bonnie could even begin to process his response, his friend Jason looked over his shoulder at her. He wasn't even trying to hide it. He just grinned and started laughing, a strange, hollow laugh that made Bonnie wonder if he was high on something. The complete lack of shame from either of them was what truly stunned her. At this point, Bonnie felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She slowly backed out of the room and stood in the hallway, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do here? Her son was committing a felony right here in her house in the middle of the morning. It was so blatant, so defiant. She knew she'd been having problems with Bradley for a long time. This wasn't the first time she had caught him doing something he shouldn't. He was known to throw huge unauthorized parties at the house whenever she wasn't home. He was constantly picking fights with his siblings, with her, with just about everyone. And she knew, though he tried to hide it, that he was spending time with known gang members. For a long time, Bonnie had tried her best to be understanding. She remembered how difficult it was being a teenager, the pressures, the confusion. She tried to be supportive, to talk to him, to guide him. But his behavior just kept getting worse. The trouble was escalating, and this stolen payphone in his bedroom, felt like a breaking point. It was a line that had been crossed, a big one. She knew in her gut that if she let this slide, if she just yelled at him and let it go, he would just keep pushing the boundaries. He would keep going further and further until he got himself seriously hurt, or hurt someone else, or ended up in prison. This was the moment. She had to put her foot down, hard. So, without saying another word to Bradley or Jason, who had already gone back to hammering and prying at the metal box, she turned around. She walked with a determined stride back down the hallway, through the living room, and into the kitchen. Her other two children, Brandon and Candace, were now both at the table, eating their cereal and looking annoyed by the loud banging coming from their brother's room. Bonnie walked right past them, her face set like stone. She picked up the kitchen phone from its cradle on the wall and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Bonnie's voice was steady as she said she wanted to report a theft. And then she gave the dispatcher her own address. After she hung up the phone, she turned to Candace and Brandon and told them to go get their backpacks and wait outside for the school bus. She didn't want them to see what was about to happen. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the front door. Bonnie opened it to find two sheriff's deputies standing on her porch. She recognized both of them, and she could tell from their expressions that they recognized her too. This wasn't the first time law enforcement had been called to the Sanborn house. They had been there several times in recent months to deal with domestic disputes, most of which were started by Bradley. As she led them inside, Bonnie felt a deep sense of failure. She was trying so hard to keep her family together, but it felt like it was falling apart at the seams. And it wasn't just Bradley. She was starting to see some of that same rebelliousness in Candace, who was acting out more and more lately. And she worried constantly about what would happen when her sweet little Brandon became a teenager. Would he follow in his older siblings' footsteps? She just didn't understand what she was doing wrong. Bonnie showed the deputies to Bradley's room. When they walked in, Bradley and Jason were still on the floor, completely engrossed in their work on the payphone. They hadn't even noticed the deputies arrive. When Bradley finally looked up and saw the two uniformed officers standing in his doorway, his face twisted in fury. He jumped to his feet and started screaming at his mother, yelling that he couldn't believe she had called the cops on him, on her own son. but Bonnie, steeling herself, pushed down the guilt that was clawing at her. She had to do this. For his own good. The deputies were calm and professional. They handcuffed both Bradley and Jason and led them out of the house. Bonnie followed close behind them, watching as they put the two teenagers in the back of the squad car. As one of the officers was about to close the door, Bonnie pulled him aside. She asked him, her voice low so the boys couldn't hear, if he could please make sure Bradley spent at least one night in the juvenile detention center. It felt like a terrible thing for a mother to ask, basically demanding that her own child be locked up. But she was desperate. She hoped that a night in juvenile hall would scare him straight. She also knew they offered counseling services there, and maybe, just maybe, someone could get through to him in a way she couldn't. The deputy nodded sympathetically and said he would see what he could do. As the squad car pulled away from the curb and drove down the street, Bonnie saw a curtain twitch in the window of the house across the street. She squinted and saw one of her neighbors peering out, trying to get a look at all the commotion. Further down the block, a couple who had been out for a morning jog had slowed to a walk and were now openly staring. Bonnie felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. She knew the people in this neighborhood were already well aware of her family's struggles. It was impossible to hide. And it made it all so much worse because, to her face, her neighbors were generally nice. Some even went out of their way to offer help. But she wasn't naive. She knew that behind closed doors, behind her back, her family was the subject of constant gossip. It was humiliating and it was frustrating, but more than anything, it made her feel incredibly isolated. Her husband, Robert, was supposed to be her partner in all of this, but he had taken a job in Maryland and was only able to come home every other weekend. She had thought about selling the house in Tucson and moving the whole family out to be with him, but with the kids' behavior, the logistics just seemed overwhelming. The good news was that Robert had been talking to his boss about a transfer back to Tucson. He was supposed to be coming home for good next week. Bonnie was just trying to hold on until then. She was trying to survive. She felt so alone, but she kept telling herself that soon Robert would be back. He would be there to help her deal with the kids, the nosy neighbors, the police. Having her partner by her side would make all the difference. About 16 hours later, around 11:45 that night, Bonnie stood in her bathroom brushing her teeth. The house was finally quiet, a rare and welcome peace. The only sound was the low hum of the television coming from the living room. She had gotten a call from the juvenile detention center earlier that afternoon. Bradley was being held on theft charges, which Bonnie believed was for the best. His friend Jason, however, was 18, an adult in the eyes of the law. He wasn't held in custody. He was just given a ticket and released that same day. Bonnie knew that as soon as Bradley got out, he and Jason would be right back together, getting into the same old trouble. It was a discouraging thought. Before she went to her own room, Bonnie walked into the living room. Her other two kids, Candace and Brandon, were sprawled out on the couch, their eyes glued to the TV. She told them it was time for bed, that they needed to turn off the television and go to their rooms. But they just ignored her, completely absorbed in whatever they were watching. It was a Friday night, and neither of them had anywhere to be in the morning. Bonnie was just too tired to fight anymore. She had done enough fighting for one day. So, she just let it go. She told them not to stay up too late, and then she left them on the couch, went to her own bedroom at the end of the hall, and turned out the lights. A few hours later, something woke Bonnie up. She groggily rolled over and glanced at the glowing red numbers on her alarm clock. It was almost 3 a.m. She could still hear the TV on out in the living room. With a heavy sigh, Bonnie cracked open her bedroom door and yelled down the dark hallway for the kids to turn off the TV and go to bed, this time for real. As she settled back down under her covers, she heard the sound of the television finally clicking off. She heard footsteps padding down the hallway, and then the house was completely silent. She closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep. But sometime later, in the deep pre-dawn darkness, she woke up again. She wasn't sure what had woken her. The house was still silent. She rolled over in her bed, and as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, they focused on something in the room with her. It was a large figure, a silhouette standing silently right beside her bed, looking down at her. Later that same morning, around 10:45 a.m., 10-year-old Brandon woke up to a house that was eerily silent. On a normal Saturday morning, his mother would have already been up for hours, making breakfast, the smell of coffee filling the house, the sound of her moving around, getting a start on the weekend chores. But as Brandon walked out into the hallway, he didn't hear a thing. He went into the kitchen to see if she was there, but it was empty. There were no dirty pans in the sink, no fresh pot of coffee brewing. It looked like his mom hadn't even been awake yet, which was very strange for her. So he went to ask his older sister, Candace, if she knew where their mom was. But Candace, just waking up herself, said she hadn't seen her. So together, Brandon and Candace walked down the hallway to their mother's bedroom. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Brandon called out for her, "Mom?" Still nothing. He hesitated for a moment, then he pushed the door open and looked inside. And the sight that met his eyes made him gasp in horror. The room was covered in blood. But the bedroom was empty. His mom wasn't there. Later that same morning, Detective Brad Faust pulled his car up to the curb outside of a house in a quiet Tucson suburb. He was there to investigate what was being called an apparent kidnapping of a mother from her own home. Faust was feeling the strain of the job. 1,995 had turned out to be the deadliest year in Tucson's history. There had already been nearly 100 murders in the county that year, and the Pima County Sheriff's Office was completely swamped. Faust was already juggling more cases than he could handle, and now he had another one. But at this point, all he knew was that a woman named Bonnie Sanborn was missing and that her kids had found blood in her bedroom. As far as anyone knew, this wasn't a murder yet. Faust was holding on to a sliver of hope that maybe this wasn't as bad as it sounded, that they would find Bonnie and that she would be okay. He got out of his car and saw that uniformed officers had already secured the scene with yellow crime scene tape. He saw a young boy and a teenage girl sitting on the front curb, their faces pale with shock and fear. Faust noticed that there was blood on both of their shirts. He correctly guessed that these must be Bonnie's kids, the ones who had called 911. He made a mental note that he would need to speak with them as soon as he could. He ducked under the tape, walked through the front yard, and went into the house. A crime scene photographer met him just inside the front door and led him down the hallway toward the master bedroom. As they walked, Faust's eyes were drawn to a family photo hanging on the wall. It showed Bonnie and her husband and their 3 children, all of them smiling, looking like the picture-perfect American family. Before they reached the bedroom, the photographer paused and turned to Faust. He warned the detective that it was bad in there, that there was a lot of blood. Faust just nodded grimly. The photographer opened the door, and Faust immediately understood the warning. The room was a nightmare. Blood was splattered across the walls, soaked into the carpet, smeared on the windows. The mattress on the bed was drenched in it. Faust felt his heart sink. He was a seasoned homicide detective, but this was one of the worst scenes he'd ever walked into. With this amount of blood loss, the chances of finding their victim alive were practically zero. But he knew they couldn't figure out what happened to her or who was responsible until they found her body. Faust carefully stepped into the room, moving closer to the bed where a forensic technician was already dusting for fingerprints. The mattress was so saturated with blood it was almost black in some places. On one of the pillows, he could clearly see the perfect bloody imprint of a hand. He figured it had to belong to either Bonnie or her attacker. They would have to wait for the lab results to know for sure. Faust stepped back to get a wider view of the room. He noticed that the bed sheets had been partially pulled off the bed and were bunched up in a ball in the middle of the blood-soaked mattress. To him, the scene screamed of a long, violent struggle. It looked like the attack had started while Bonnie was in bed, and that most of the violence had happened right there. He also saw a folding knife with a bright red handle lying on the mattress. Nearby, a purse had been emptied out. Multiple credit cards and a checkbook were scattered across the bed. The fact that these valuable items were left behind made Faust think that robbery probably wasn't the motive for whatever had happened to Bonnie. Then, something small on the floor by the bed caught his eye. After checking with the photographer to make sure the area had already been documented, Faust put on a pair of latex gloves, crouched down, and carefully picked it up. It was a small, brown button. He took it over to the closet and started going through the clothes hanging inside, but the button didn't seem to match anything that belonged to Bonnie. Based on where he found it, Faust theorized that the button must have been torn off someone's clothing during the struggle. It could have come from the clothes Bonnie was wearing, or it could have come from her attacker. Faust gave the button to a forensics officer and told him to bag it as evidence. He continued to scan the room. Amidst all the chaotic blood spatter, he noticed a distinct trail of red droplets snaking across the carpet. The trail led directly to a sliding glass door that opened into the backyard. He went over and tried the handle. It was unlocked. The forensics officer working in the room confirmed that no one from their team had touched that door all morning. It must have been left unlocked by the killer. Faust slid the door open and stepped out into the backyard. He followed the trail of blood droplets across the grass, all the way to a side door that led into the garage. He noted that there were no drag marks in the grass. This suggested that Bonnie's attacker hadn't dragged her out of the house. They had carried her. This implied the attacker was likely bigger and stronger than Bonnie. But then, looking at the family photos again, Faust could see that Bonnie was a very petite woman. That didn't really narrow down the list of suspects very much. Many people could have been strong enough to carry her. Faust reached the door to the garage and turned the knob. It was also unlocked. He pushed it open and looked inside. The garage was empty, there was no car, but the trail of blood clearly continued a few feet inside before it stopped. The picture was becoming clearer in Faust's mind. The suspect had carried Bonnie from her bedroom through the backyard and into this garage. They had then loaded her into the car that was normally parked here, and they had driven away with her. Faust knew that his best chance of finding Bonnie now was to identify the missing car and put out an alert for it. Once he had finished his initial survey of the crime scene, Faust went back outside. He found Bonnie's two younger children, Candace and Brandon, still sitting on the curb. He crouched down next to them. They were both still visibly shaken, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. Faust, in a very gentle voice, asked them to tell him about the last time they had seen their mother. Candace spoke up first. She said the last time she actually saw her was around 11:45 the night before, when their mom had said goodnight and gone to bed. But, she added, around 3:00 inches the morning, she and Brandon were still up watching TV when their mom had yelled from her bedroom for them to turn it off and go to sleep. She said that after their mom yelled, they got up, turned off the TV, and went to their own rooms. Both kids insisted that they didn't hear or see anything else unusual until they woke up that morning and made the horrific discovery in their mother's bedroom. This timeline gave Faust something to work with. If the kids were telling the truth, then Bonnie must have disappeared sometime after 3 a.m. It also suggested something else about the killer. If the suspect was able to get in through the sliding glass door in Bonnie's bedroom, attack her, find her car keys, and then carry her out to the garage and drive away, all without waking anyone else in the house, it strongly suggested that this person was familiar with the layout of the house. They had probably been there before. This might be someone the family knew. Faust then pointed to the bloodstains on Candace and Brandon's shirts and asked them how they got there. Candace admitted that before they called 911, she and her brother had gone into the bedroom and desperately searched for their mom, hoping she was just hurt and hiding somewhere. In their frantic search, they had gotten blood on their clothes. Faust understood. They were just kids, terrified and looking for their mother. But he also knew, with a sinking feeling, that this meant his primary crime scene was now contaminated. The kids had likely touched multiple surfaces, moved things around, and inadvertently destroyed or obscured potential evidence. But he didn't say any of this to them. He just calmly told them to go inside, change their clothes, and give the bloody clothes to one of the forensics technicians. He also instructed them to stay far away from their mother's bedroom. Candace nodded, stood up, and took her little brother by the hand. As they walked back toward the house, another sheriff's deputy approached Faust. The deputy told him there was someone else he needed to talk to. Bonnie had another child, a 15-year-old son named Bradley. That evening, Detective Faust walked down the sterile hallway of the Pima County Juvenile Court Center, a file folder tucked under his arm. He opened the door to a small, windowless office. A teenage boy was already sitting inside, waiting for him. Faust recognized him from the mugshot in the file. It was Bradley Sanborn, Bonnie's oldest son. Faust walked in and sat down across from him. As gently as he could, he broke the news to Bradley that his mother was missing. He explained that based on the evidence they found in her bedroom, it appeared she had been viciously attacked, kidnapped, and that there was a very real possibility she was no longer alive. Faust knew that Bradley couldn't have physically been the one to attack his mother. He had a rock-solid alibi, being locked up in this very facility at the time of the attack. But Faust had been doing some digging into Bradley's friends. He opened the file folder he was carrying and spread the papers out on the desk in front of Bradley. He began showing Bradley the information he had gathered on his friend, Jason Horbachevsky. Jason was a known gang member, and according to several police informants, he was known for always carrying a knife. There were even stories that he would sometimes pull the knife out and bizarrely stab himself in the side of the head. Faust wondered aloud if the red-handled folding knife they'd found on Bonnie's mattress belonged to Jason. He suggested that maybe the attack on Bonnie was an act of revenge for her calling the police on Jason and Bradley just the day before. But as Faust watched Bradley for a reaction, he saw that the boy's tough exterior had completely crumbled. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, and he choked out that he didn't know anything. He admitted that he and his mom argued a lot, but he swore he would never, ever hurt her. To Faust, Bradley's grief seemed completely genuine. He immediately concluded that if Jason's gang was involved in his mother's disappearance, Bradley was not in on the plan. Asking Bradley more questions seemed like a dead end. Faust decided his next step was to find Jason and talk to him directly. Later that same night, Faust was back at the station, a cold cup of coffee on his desk, sifting through police records on Bradley, Jason, and Jason's gang. After leaving the juvenile center, Faust had immediately sent officers out to find and interview Jason, but it was proving to be much more difficult than he had anticipated. He knew Jason wasn't in custody, but he also wasn't at any of his previously known addresses. He had basically vanished. So Faust had officers fanning out across the city, talking to as many of Jason's known associates and fellow gang members as they could find, hoping someone knew where he was or knew something about Bonnie's disappearance. So far, they had come up empty on both fronts. Just then, the door to Faust's office opened. A deputy poked his head in and told him there was someone in the lobby he should probably talk to. Faust got up, walked out to the front lobby, and was surprised to see Jason Horbachevsky sitting there, waiting for him. When Jason saw Faust, he stood up, a cocky, confident smirk on his face. He told Faust that he'd heard the sheriff's department was looking for him, and he was there to show them he had nothing to hide. Faust didn't even bother asking him where he had been. He just led him straight back to an interrogation room. As they sat down at the table across from each other, Faust's eyes were immediately drawn to the buttons on Jason's shirt. They were small and brown, just like the one he had found on the floor of Bonnie's bedroom. And as he looked closer, he saw that a few of the buttons on the shirt were missing. Faust felt a jolt of excitement, but he kept his expression neutral. He decided not to ask about the button just yet. He didn't want to show his hand too early. Instead, he started the interview with standard questions, asking Jason about his friendship with Bradley, his relationship with Bonnie, and his whereabouts on the night of the attack. Jason admitted that he was angry at Bonnie for calling the cops on them, but he denied having any plan for revenge. He insisted he had no idea where Bonnie was or what had happened to her. He claimed he had been at home, asleep, on the night she was attacked. At the end of the interview, he readily agreed to give Faust a DNA sample. He even took off his shirt with the missing brown buttons and turned it over for forensic analysis. After that, Faust let Jason go. He had a strong feeling he had his man, but he would have to wait for the lab to confirm it. The next morning, Sunday, December 10th, Faust was back in his office, organizing the mountain of information his team had collected over the past 24 hours. While he had been dealing with Bradley and Jason, other detectives had been re-interviewing Bonnie's friends, family, and neighbors. But so far, no one had any useful information. A few neighbors had confirmed that the Sanborns were a troubled family, but beyond that, they all said Bonnie was a nice person, and they couldn't imagine who would want to hurt her. Faust was reading through the interview transcripts, searching for any small clue he might have missed when his office phone rang. He picked it up. The man on the other end of the line sounded panicked. He said he had a tip about the Bonnie Sanborn case. The man explained that earlier that morning he had seen a news report about Bonnie's disappearance. The report had mentioned that police were looking for her car, a light blue Chrysler. The man said that just the day before, he and his wife had been out for a run and had passed a car exactly like that. It was abandoned on the side of a dirt road in the desert just outside of town. He said at the time they hadn't gotten too close to it and hadn't really thought anything of it. But after seeing the news report, he and his wife had driven back out to the desert to see if the car was still there. He said not only was it still there, but when they got up close and looked in the window, they could see what looked like a woman's body in the back seat. Faust immediately wrote down the location. When he checked it on a map, he realized the spot was only about a half a mile from Bonnie's house. He thanked the man for calling, hung up the phone, and raced out to his car. He drove out past the edge of town into the open desert, and sure enough, up ahead, he saw a light blue Chrysler parked in the sand. He pulled his own car over, got out, and cautiously approached the Chrysler. He peered through the back window, and his heart sank. He saw a woman's body slumped over in the back seat. It was Bonnie. He had been holding out hope, but seeing her there, dead in such a brutal and undignified way, was just heartbreaking. Faust walked back to his car and radioed for the forensics team. Once they arrived and began processing the new scene, he went back over to the Chrysler to examine the body more closely. He put on a fresh pair of gloves and leaned into the car. He gently lifted Bonnie's head and saw that there were multiple severe wounds all over her skull, as if she had been repeatedly struck with a sharp, heavy object. Her partial nudity also made it clear that a sexual assault had likely occurred. There were also numerous defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, clear evidence that she had fought back hard against her killer. One of the forensics officers pulled out a black light and began scanning the back seat of the car for biological evidence. As he ran the light over Bonnie's leg, a spot on her skin lit up brightly. The officer told Faust that it was almost certainly the killer's semen. He carefully took a swab of the area, placed it in an evidence bag, and told Faust that within a few weeks, they should have a full DNA profile of their killer. In the meantime, the fingerprints that had been lifted from Bonnie's bedroom were analyzed, and the results came back with a match that surprised everyone, especially Detective Faust. All of the prints, including the bloody handprint on the pillow, belonged to Bonnie's 13-year-old daughter, Candace. As much as Faust didn't want to believe that a young girl could be involved in a plot to murder her own mother, he now had to seriously consider it. Not just because of the prints, but because of the well-documented history of problems within the Sanborn family. He knew Candace couldn't have committed this crime on her own, but it was possible she had helped whoever did. Faust brought Candace in for questioning again. When he confronted her with the fingerprint evidence, she completely broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. She insisted again that she had just been scared and confused, that she had gone into the room looking for her mom and hadn't realized she was touching everything and leaving her prints all over the place. Looking at the terrified teenager, Faust's gut told him she wasn't involved. She just seemed like a scared kid who had stumbled into a nightmare. But he was still convinced that Bonnie's killer had to be someone who knew her personally, someone who had been in her house before. And that left one major person of interest who had not yet been ruled out, Bonnie's husband, Robert. Later that day, Faust was sitting at his desk, the phone pressed to his ear, listening to terrible hold music. On his desk was a handwritten list of airline names and flight numbers. Bonnie's husband, Robert, was supposed to have been in Maryland on the weekend his wife was killed. But just because he said he was there didn't mean it was true. Faust knew there were multiple flights that Robert could have secretly taken from Maryland back to Tucson, giving him a window of opportunity to commit the murder and then fly back to work in time for his next shift. So Faust had compiled a list of every possible flight Robert could have taken, and he was now painstakingly calling each airline one by one to check the passenger manifests. So far, he had struck out. Robert Sanborn's name hadn't appeared on any of the flights he had checked. He was now on hold with the very last airline on his list. Just then, the music cut out and an airline representative came on the line. She told Faust that she had triple-checked her records and there was no Robert Sanborn on that flight either. He thanked her and hung up the phone with a sigh. He knew this didn't completely clear Robert. This was before 9/11, and air travel security was much more lax back then. It was possible for someone to fly on a domestic flight without even showing an ID. Robert could have easily traveled under a fake name. But there was one more step he could take. He would ask Robert for a DNA sample. When the lab results came back for the sample found on Bonnie's body, he would have a definitive answer. One morning in early January of 1996, about a month after Bonnie's murder, Faust's office phone rang. It was a technician from the crime lab on the other end. In the weeks since Bonnie's body was found, 5 more murders had occurred in the Tucson area, and Faust and his team were stretched to their breaking point. So when the lab tech said he had results in the Bonnie Sanborn case, it took Faust a moment to remember which case he was talking about. But once he did, he sat up straight at his desk and grabbed a pen. He held his breath as the lab tech delivered the news. The DNA from the sample found on Bonnie's leg was not a match for her husband Robert. Nor was it a match for her son's friend, Jason Horbachevsky. The lab also confirmed that the brown buttons from Jason's shirt were not a match for the button found in Bonnie's bedroom. It was just a bizarre coincidence. Faust was deeply disappointed. He had really thought Jason was their guy. But he wasn't going to give up. He asked the lab tech to run the killer's DNA profile against the state's database of convicted sex offenders to see if they could get a match there. But as the weeks turned into months, the crime lab kept calling with the same update, no match. The investigation stalled. Faust was pulled off to work on other, more active cases. By the summer of 1996, it was looking like Bonnie Sanborn's murder was going to go cold. And then, after 9 long months with no progress, an anonymous tip came in. That September, Detective Faust sat in an interrogation room at the sheriff's department across a small table from a 40-year-old drug dealer named Lyle Winstead. The anonymous tipster had claimed that Lyle sold drugs in Bonnie's neighborhood and that he had been saying some very suspicious things about the case. When Faust had looked into Lyle's background, he found that he had a history of violent crimes, many of them involving knives. Now, sitting in the interrogation room, Lyle was visibly nervous, constantly shifting in his chair, his eyes darting around the room. When Faust started asking him questions about Bonnie's murder, Lyle began making strange excuses for the killer. He said that maybe the killer wasn't such a bad guy, that maybe he was just, in Lyle's words, on a bad trip. Faust found his behavior incredibly suspicious. He asked Lyle for a DNA sample, and Lyle agreed. Faust sent the sample off to the crime lab and then had to endure another several weeks of waiting for the results. When they finally came in, it was another dead end. Lyle Winstead was not a match. At this point, Faust was beyond frustrated. They had put so much time and effort into this case with absolutely nothing to show for it. He didn't want to see Bonnie's file get put back on the shelf to gather dust. He decided to go back to the very beginning to re-examine every single piece of evidence, every interview, to make sure he hadn't missed something. The next month, in between working his other cases, Faust found the time to go door to door through Bonnie's neighborhood and re-interview every single person his team had already spoken to almost a year earlier. He knew how gossip and rumors could spread in a tight-knit community like this one. Even though no one had been able to offer any solid leads the first time around, he wondered if maybe some new information might have surfaced in the months since the murder. So he knocked on one door after another, patiently asking the same questions over and over again. And eventually, at a house just down the street from Bonnie's, a woman told him something. She said she didn't know anything herself, but there was a rumor circulating in the neighborhood that he might want to look into. Faust listened intently. And after so many frustrating false starts and dead ends, it was this small neighborhood rumor that would finally allow him to solve the case. Based on that rumor, and the DNA and other evidence that was later uncovered, this is what police believe happened to Bonnie Sanborn on the night of the 9th of December 1995. Around 2:30 inches the morning, her killer was watching her house from a hiding spot across the street. The killer knew the Sanborns were planning to move to Maryland, and he felt a strange sense of urgency, like there was something he had to do before they left. Around 3 a.m., the killer saw the light in Bonnie's living room finally go dark. A few moments later, he saw some movement behind the curtains in one of the bedroom windows, and then that light went out too, plunging the entire house into darkness. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He wanted to make sure that not just Bonnie, but her children were asleep before he went inside. Confident that the coast was clear, the killer grabbed his tools, a set of flex ties and a chipping hammer. A chipping hammer is a specific type of tool used by welders, with a normal hammer face on one side and a sharp, pointed pick on the other. Carrying this brutal weapon, he crept across the street, through Bonnie's backyard, and right up to the sliding glass door at the back of the house. He knew from past experience that the family often left it unlocked. He was right. The door slid open without a sound. He knew that this door led directly into Bonnie's bedroom. After sliding the door open, the killer stepped inside. He saw Bonnie in her bed, asleep under the covers, began to move toward her, but as he stepped closer, a floorboard creaked loudly under his weight. Bonnie stirred in her sleep. She rolled over and looked in the direction of the sound. Her eyes met the killer's in the darkness. He knew he had lost the element of surprise. He had to act. No. He lunged at the bed. Bonnie tried to fight back, but it was no use. The kill element was too strong and completely overpowered her, striking her repeatedly with the hammer. Once Bonnie stopped struggling, but while she was still alive, the killer used the flex ties to bind her hands tightly behind her back. Then, as she lay helpless and bleeding on the bed, he frantically searched the room for her purse. When he found it, he dumped its contents out onto the bed until he found what he was looking for, her car keys. He grabbed the keys, and then he picked up Bonnie's still-living body, carried her back out through the sliding glass door, across the backyard, and into the garage. There, he used her keys to unlock her blue Chrysler. He put Bonnie in the back seat, then he got into the driver's seat and drove out into the desert, parking on the side of a quiet, deserted road. When the killer was finished with Bonnie, he simply got out of the car, left her there, and began the short walk back into town. As the sun began to rise, the killer casually walked right back down Bonnie's street, back to his own house, just a few doors down. It turned out that Detective Faust had been so focused on suspects within Bonnie's immediate circle of family and friends that he had overlooked the person who was, quite literally, the closest to her. Her across-the-street neighbor, 22-year-old Freddie Royval. Freddie and his father had done some repair work at Bonnie's house in the past, so he was familiar with the layout. The rumor that the neighbor had told Faust was that Freddie had a crush on Bonnie, that he found her attractive. Another rumor was also circulating about a woman in the neighborhood being assaulted by a younger man, and some people suspected it was Freddie. It wasn't much to go on, but it was all Faust had. So police made the decision to collect DNA samples from every young man living on that block. And when the results came back, Freddie Royval's DNA was a perfect match to the sample found on Bonnie's body. Freddie Royval was arrested in January of 1997, a little over a year after he murdered Bonnie Sanborn. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But for the people who lived on that quiet Tucson street, the most disturbing part of the case was never just the brutality of the murder itself. It was the realization that Bonnie's killer had been there the entire time. Watching from across the street, walking past her house, blending into the neighborhood like nothing was wrong. And while Bonnie spent her final months worrying about the dangers inside her own home, The real threat had been waiting just outside of it all along. In the spring of 1966, in a quiet neighborhood in the Bronx, New York, an elderly woman named Elsie Litt was found murdered in her apartment. The discovery was made by a concerned neighbor who hadn't seen Elsie for a couple of days. Normally, Elsie was a creature of habit. She would be out for her morning walk or tending to the small flower box on her windowsill. Her absence was noticeable, and it felt wrong. When police entered her apartment, they found a scene that was both tragic and puzzling. Elsie was in her bedroom. The official cause of death was determined to be a combination of strangulation and multiple stab wounds. The investigators on the scene noted these specific details with professional detachment. The ligature used for the strangulation appeared to be a torn piece of a dirty bedsheet twisted tightly around her neck. She had also been stabbed repeatedly with what the coroner later identified as a thin, sharp blade, something like a stiletto or a paring knife. On her bedside table, a cup of what looked like hot chocolate sat undisturbed, now cold. The apartment showed some signs of a minor struggle, but there was no forced entry. This suggested that Elsie had likely known her killer, or at least had willingly let them into her home. The police began their investigation, starting with the people who knew Elsie. But the thing was, Elsie Litt lived a very quiet life. She was a widow, her children were grown and lived in other states, and her social circle was small, mostly consisting of a few other elderly neighbors in her building. Detectives interviewed everyone they could, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. They canvassed the neighborhood looking for witnesses, but came up empty. They processed the crime scene for fingerprints and any other forensic evidence, but in 1966, the technology was limited. The killer had been careful, leaving behind very little. The case quickly grew cold. For 9 long months, the murder of Elsie Litt remained unsolved, a troubling file in a cabinet at the local precinct. The city moved on, and for most people, the quiet old woman who was violently killed in her own home became a forgotten statistic. But for a few, the memory lingered. Fast forward 9 months to the evening of the 12th of December, 1966. A four-year-old man named Jose Lorente stood outside an apartment door, also in the Bronx, not too far from where Elsie Litt had lived. Jose was a tailor by day, a meticulous man who worked with thread and fabric. But by night, he had a different trade. He held a large, heavy bag in his hand as he knocked on the door. After a moment, the door opened, just a tiny crack. A woman's wary eyes peered out at him. She recognized him, saw the bag he was carrying, and then opened the door just enough for him to slip inside. As soon as he was in, she quickly shut the door and slid the bolt lock into place with a heavy thud. The woman was clearly on edge. She led Jose through a small hallway and into the living room. Sitting on the couch, under the dim light of a single lamp, was her son, a 4-year-old man named Ivan Barbosa. Ivan looked terrible. He had dark circles under his eyes, his posture was slumped, and he had the haunted, vacant stare of a person who hadn't had a proper night's sleep in weeks. And according to the story his mother had told Jose over the phone, that was exactly the problem. You see, Jose Lorente's second job was far more unique than his first. He was a self-proclaimed psychic medium. He specialized in conducting spiritual cleansings for people who believed they were being haunted. People like Ivan. It was Ivan's mother who had called him, desperate for help. She said her son was being tormented by the ghost of an old woman. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, and he was becoming a shell of his former self. They had heard about Jose through a friend of a friend, someone who said Jose had a gift for dealing with these kinds of things. But here's the secret. Jose did not actually believe in ghosts. Not at all. He was a firm skeptic. He knew that the elaborate rituals and cleansings he performed were not supernatural. He saw them as a form of psychological therapy. In his experience, when people believed they were being haunted, it was usually a manifestation of something much more mundane, like severe stress or grief or profound loneliness. His ceremonies, with all their candles and incense and incantations, were essentially a powerful placebo. He would act the part convincingly, and by doing so, he gave his clients the permission they needed to believe the problem was gone. And surprisingly often, it worked. They would feel better, the haunting would cease, and life would go back to normal. So, while Jose knew he was technically deceiving people, he felt the ends justified the means. He was helping people who felt they had nowhere else to turn. So on this night, Jose sat down in a chair across from Ivan and his mother. He looked at Ivan with a calm, reassuring expression and did what he always did. He asked him to tell him about the haunting. Ivan was visibly nervous, his hands trembling as he clasped them in his lap. He started to speak, his voice a low stammer at first. He explained that for months, every single night, the ghost of an old woman would appear in his room. He didn't know who she was, just that she was old and she would stand in the corner just staring at him. But recently, it had gotten worse. He said her expression was changing. Every night, she seemed to get angrier and angrier. Her silent stare had become a terrifying glare. Ivan was now so petrified that he couldn't even bring himself to go into his own bedroom at night. He was convinced this spirit meant to do him harm. He was living in a constant state of fear. Jose nodded along, listening patiently, showing deep sympathy on his face. Inwardly, he was thinking this sounded like a classic case of sleep deprivation psychosis mixed with anxiety. But he knew what mattered was that Ivan believed it was real. That was the problem he was here to fix. When Ivan finished his story, his voice trembling, Jose leaned forward slightly. He told Ivan that he understood his fear, but that he knew exactly how to help. He explained his plan. They were going to conduct a séance. The goal was to make contact with this spirit, to communicate with her, and to ask her to leave Ivan alone and find peace. Ivan looked incredibly doubtful, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and skepticism. But his mother put a reassuring hand on his shoulder, and Jose spoke with such confidence, telling them he had performed this ceremony many times and it almost always worked. Ivan, desperate for any kind of relief, finally, reluctantly, agreed. He just nodded his head slowly. Okay, let's do it. With that, Jose reached down and opened the large bag he had brought with him. He began to take out his supplies, the tools of his trade. He worked methodically, creating a specific atmosphere in the room. First, he took out several large black sheets of fabric. He carefully draped them over the television set and a small radio in the corner. This, he explained, was to symbolically shut out the noise and distractions of the outside world to create a sacred space. Next, he arranged a dozen small white candles in a large circle on the living room floor. In the very center of this circle was a low coffee table. On the table, he placed a very old, leather-bound Bible. Next to it, he set a small brass dish for incense. Once everything was in place, he went around the room and lit each candle one by one, filling the room with a soft, flickering glow. Then he lit the stick of incense, and a thin ribbon of sweet-smelling smoke began to curl up towards the ceiling. The room now felt completely different, hushed and solemn. As a final touch, Jose went to the windows and drew the blinds, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the dancing candlelight. He then asked Ivan and his mother to come and sit with him on the floor, inside the circle of candles near the coffee table. They did as he asked, settling onto the carpet. The three of them now sat in a small triangle, the air thick with anticipation. Jose began the ceremony. He picked up the old Bible from the table, opened it to a random page, and read a short prayer in a low, sonorous voice. It was a prayer for peace and protection. When he finished, he closed the book and placed it back on the table. Then he looked at Ivan, then at his mother, and told them to hold hands. Jose reached out and took Ivan's right hand and his mother's left, completing the circle. Now, he said softly, I want you both to close your eyes. Do not open them until I tell you to. They complied. The only sound in the room was the faint crackle of the candle wicks and their own breathing. And then, Jose did what he always did at this point in his seances. He spoke into the silence, his voice calm and clear. If there are any spirits in this room, he called out, We ask you to give us a sign of your presence. We mean you no harm. We are here to listen. Now, this was the part where Jose usually had to get a little creative. Typically, he would just wait. He'd listen for any random noise in the building. The groan of pipes, the floorboards settling, a gust of wind rattling the window pane. Any small sound could be interpreted as a sign from the spirit world. It was all about presentation. And if the building was too quiet, if no natural sound occurred after a minute or so, Jose had a backup plan. He would subtly tap his own foot on the floor, just hard enough for the others to hear it. Then he would say, "Did you hear that?" The spirit is making contact. It was simple but effective. So there they sat, in the dark, holding hands, eyes closed. Jose was listening, waiting for a sound he could use. A full minute passed in total silence. Nothing. He was just about to go for the foot tap trick. But then, something happened. Something that had never, ever happened to him before. An intense, jolting sensation shot through his entire body, like he had been struck by a bolt of electricity. His muscles went completely rigid. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His vision instantly went black, as if a switch had been flipped off in his brain. And then, a series of bright, chaotic images began flashing through his mind. They came and went so fast it was a dizzying, confusing storm of pictures. He saw a cup of hot chocolate rattling on a small table. He saw a stained, torn piece of a bedsheet being twisted by a pair of dirty, grimy hands. He saw a single, wide-open eye staring in terror. A screaming mouth. Then a flash of red, then a glint of silver, then red again. The images cycled over and over, faster and faster, a terrifying, nonsensical loop. Suddenly, Jose felt his own mouth open. He wanted to scream for help, to tell them something was terribly wrong, but he had no control. Instead of his own voice, a sound came out that was completely alien. It was a high-pitched, raspy shriek. It was a voice that sounded old and full of rage, and it seemed to be coming through him, not from him. It was speaking, forming what might have been words, but the rhythm was strange, and the sound was so grating he couldn't make sense of it. The images were still flashing in his mind, everything was happening at once, and it was pure chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, it stopped. The voice coming from his throat cut off. His mind went completely blank. His body, which had been rigid as a board, went totally limp. He slumped forward and slowly, very slowly, came back to himself. He found himself lying on the floor, his head on the carpet, feeling completely disoriented and weak. For a moment, he had no idea where he was or what had just happened. Then, his eyes focused. He saw the circle of candles, the incense smoke still lingering in the air. He remembered. He was in the apartment. He was doing a seance. But something had gone horribly wrong. His body ached all over, and his throat felt raw and scraped, like he'd been screaming for hours. What on earth just happened? As Jose slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, trying to make sense of it all, his first rational thought was that he must have had some kind of seizure. A stroke, maybe. Whatever it was a medical emergency, and he probably needed to get to a hospital. But as he looked around the dimly lit room, taking in his surroundings, he noticed three things that were very, very wrong. First, the front door of the apartment, which the mother had so carefully bolted shut, was now standing wide open, letting in the faint light from the hallway. Second, Ivan's mother was cowering in the corner of the room, staring at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She was looking at him as if he were a monster. And third, her son Ivan was gone. Jose's head was spinning, but he managed to speak. His voice was hoarse. He asked Ivan's mom, "What happened? Where's Ivan?" The story she told him in a panicked, trembling voice completely contradicted everything Jose thought he believed about the world, about science, and about ghosts. According to her, in the middle of the seance, Jose's body had suddenly gone stiff. His eyes had rolled back in his head until only the whites were showing. Then he had straightened up, his posture unnaturally rigid, and he had turned his head and looked directly at Ivan, even though his eyes were closed. And then he began to speak. But it wasn't his voice. She said it was a shrill, raspy voice, the voice of an old woman, filled with an unearthly rage. She was convinced it was the ghost that had been haunting her son, that it had taken possession of Jose's body. And this ghost, speaking through Jose, had said something to Ivan. Something so terrifying that Ivan had let out a scream, scrambled to his feet, and sprinted out of the apartment without a second's hesitation. Now, Jose was listening to this, and his rational mind was screaming that this was impossible. He was thinking, this woman was already convinced her son was being haunted. She's just interpreting what happened through that lens. I had a seizure, and it scared her and her son. That's all. There are no such things as ghosts. He tried to tell himself that over and over. But a small part of him, a part that remembered the electric shock, the blackness, the horrifying images, couldn't fully dismiss it. He couldn't explain what had happened to him. But regardless of what had actually occurred, he felt a wave of guilt. Whatever his medical episode looked like, it had clearly terrified Ivan, a young man who was already in a very fragile mental state. And now, he had run off into the night. At this point, Jose just wanted to leave. The whole situation had spiraled completely out of his control. He no longer wanted to pretend to be a psychic. He just wanted to go home. He stood up on shaky legs, began gathering his candles and his Bible, and stuffing them back into his bag. He apologized profusely to Ivan's mother, who was pleading with him to stay to explain what had happened. But Jose just shook his head. "I can't," he said. "I have to go. I'm sure Ivan will be back soon. I'm sorry." And with that, he walked out of the open door, leaving the terrified woman alone in her candlelit living room, and he went home. In the days that followed, Jose tried to put the incident out of his mind. He assumed Ivan had just gotten spooked and would eventually return home once he calmed down. He thought the family was dealing with a mental health crisis, not a supernatural one. He figured Ivan would be fine. But Ivan didn't come back home. After a few days of frantic waiting, his mother called the police and reported him missing. The police launched a search, and eventually, they found him. Ivan Barbosa was in a cheap hotel room in a neighboring town. He was dead. He had died from a single self-inflicted gunshot wound. When the police looked at the scene, it seemed like a straightforward, open-and-shut case. A troubled young man had taken his own life. That was the end of the story. But when they delivered the news to Ivan's mother, she was adamant that they were wrong. There was more to it, she insisted. And she told them over and over that they needed to talk to the psychic medium, Jose Lorente. She explained that right before her son ran away and ended his life, they had held a seance. And during that seance, Jose had said something to Ivan, something that sent him fleeing in terror. She was convinced that whatever Jose had said was the direct cause of her son's death. The police were, of course, extremely skeptical. A psychic medium? A seance? A ghost? It sounded like nonsense. They were busy people, and this sounded like the ramblings of a grieving, delusional mother. But she was persistent. She called the station every day, telling the same story, begging them to just go and talk to this man, Jose. Finally, just to appease her, 2 detectives agreed to pay him a visit. When they found Jose at his tailor shop, he was clearly shaken to hear that Ivan was dead. The detectives asked him about the seance, and Jose was surprisingly candid. He told them he didn't actually believe in ghosts and that he thought he had suffered some kind of medical episode, maybe a seizure. He told them he had no memory of speaking during the event. "I don't remember saying anything," he explained. "All I remember is when I blacked out, I was seeing these weird visions in my head." The detectives, mostly just going through the motions, asked him, "What kind of visions?" Jose paused, trying to recall the chaotic images. He said they were jumbled and confusing, but a few of them stood out very clearly in his memory. "I saw a torn bedsheet," he said, "and there were dirty hands twisting it. I saw something silver, like a thin sliver of metal, like a knife. And I saw a cup of hot chocolate, and it was rattling on a table." He said it all felt like a bizarre dream and that he was sure it was just his brain misfiring during the seizure. He didn't think any of it was important. He just felt terrible that his medical problem had scared Ivan so badly. But as he was saying this, he noticed the two detectives were looking at each other. Their casual, slightly bored expressions had vanished. They were now looking at him with intense focus. One of them pulled out a notepad and said, "Sir, could you please tell us again exactly what you saw in your vision?" Jose, confused by their sudden interest, repeated the details again. The torn, dirty bedsheet. The silver knife. The rattling cup of hot chocolate. The detectives were stunned into silence. Because it turned out, those details were not random. They were the highly specific, non-public details from the 9-month-old unsolved murder case of an elderly woman named Elsie Litt. She had been strangled with a dirty, torn bedsheet. She had been stabbed with a thin, silver knife. And there had been a cup of hot chocolate on her bedside table when her body was found. These were details only the killer and the police knew. There was absolutely no way Jose Lorente, a simple tailor, should have known any of this. The police suddenly had a shocking new theory. What if Ivan wasn't being haunted by a random ghost? What if he was being haunted by the ghost of the woman he had murdered? And what did the ghost, speaking through Jose, say to him that night? The detectives went back to Ivan's mother and asked her that exact question. What were the exact words spoken during the seance? She looked at them, her eyes filled with a new kind of dread, and she told them. She said that when Jose had gone into his trance, he had looked right at her son and shrieked in that horrible old woman's voice, "You killed me, and you're going to die the same way." For Ivan, this must have been the ultimate confirmation of his worst fears. He wasn't just being haunted, he was being judged. The ghost of his victim had found him, and she was promising him a similar fate. The guilt and terror that had been manifesting as a haunting had finally culminated in a direct, terrifying accusation from the spirit world itself. He ran, not just from the apartment, but from the truth he could no longer escape. The police, armed with this incredible story, reopened the Elsie Litt murder investigation. They began to dig into Ivan Barbosa's life, looking for any connection, however small, to the murdered woman. They discovered that Ivan lived only a few blocks away from Elsie's apartment. He could have known her, at least by sight. While they never found a concrete motive, the theory they pieced together was that Ivan had likely broken into her apartment to rob her, things went wrong, and he ended up killing her. For 9 months, he got away with it. But his guilt ate away at him, twisting itself into the terrifying nightly visions of his victim. He wasn't being haunted by a ghost, he was being haunted by his own conscience. The seance was supposed to be his salvation, a way to banish the ghost. Instead, it became his final judgment. Faced with what he believed was a direct accusation from beyond the grave, he couldn't live with the guilt any longer and took his own life. Based on the chillingly accurate details provided by Jose Lorente during his unexplained trance, the police officially closed the murder case of Elsie Litt. They named Ivan Barbosa as her killer. As for Jose, he was never the same. He was a man of logic and reason, a skeptic to his core. But he had experienced something that night that he could never logically explain. He had no memory of speaking Elsie Litt's judgment, but the evidence was undeniable. He had, it seemed, become a genuine conduit for the spirit world. The experience terrified him so much that he immediately gave up his work as a psychic medium and never conducted another seance again. Tonight's stories remind us that sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are not those hidden in the dark, but those concealed within the human mind. Whether it is guilt, fear, coincidence, or something much more inexplicable, each of these cases leaves behind questions that haunt people for decades afterward.